What if I told you that beneath the frozen wilderness of Alaska lies something older and more mysterious than the pyramids of Egypt? Something so dangerous that the government has spent decades covering it up. Tonight, we dive into one of the most chilling conspiracy theories ever documented, the story of the Alaskan Black Pyramid. But first, make sure to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories, and leave your video ideas in the comments below. May 22nd, 1992. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. Working the graveyard shift at KTU Channel 2 in Anchorage wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me access to equipment most people never got to see. I was 24, fresh out of technical college, and convinced I was going to revolutionize broadcast journalism with my keen eye for detail. That night changed everything. The seismograph feeds had been rolling in steadily since the China Lake earthquake hit earlier that day, a 7.3 magnitude monster that rattled California and sent shockwaves rippling across the Pacific. Standard procedure was to log the incoming data, file the interesting bits for potential weather segments, and archive the rest. Earthquakes were news, especially big ones, and our meteorologists loved having dramatic seismic readings to show during the morning broadcast. But something was wrong with the Alaska readings. I first noticed it around 3:17 a.m. when the feed from our Fairbanks affiliate came through. The seismograph trace looked nothing like what I'd been seeing from the other stations, where California, Washington, and even Hawaii showed the classic earthquake signature, sharp initial spikes followed by gradually diminishing aftershocks. The Alaska readings displayed something else entirely. Perfect geometric patterns, symmetrical waves, rhythmic pulses that looked more like a heartbeat than seismic activity. I rewound the tape 3 times, thinking there might be a technical malfunction, but the timestamp was clear. 11:42 p.m., May 22, 1992. The same time the China Lake quake reached our monitoring stations. Only this wasn't recording the California earthquake at all. This was something else, something local. The patterns were too regular, too precise. Natural earthquakes don't pulse in perfect intervals. They don't create mathematical sequences, and they sure as hell don't generate signals that look like someone was transmitting from underground. I made copies of everything, 3 different tapes, plus detailed printouts of the most unusual segments. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, would want to see this first thing in the morning. This was the kind of anomaly that could put our little Anchorage station on the national map. When Janet arrived at 6:00 a.m., I practically ambushed her with my discovery. She listened patiently as I explained the readings, showed her the comparisons between Alaska and the other monitoring stations, and outlined my theory that we detected some kind of previously unknown seismic phenomenon. "Interesting," she said, studying the printouts. "Very interesting. Let me make some calls." 2 hours later, Janet returned with news that should have excited me, but instead left me feeling hollow. "False readings," she announced, dropping my carefully organized files into the trash. "Equipment malfunction at the Fairbanks station. They had a power surge that corrupted the incoming data. Happens all the time during major seismic events." "But I checked the logs," I protested. "There's no record of any power problems and the timestamps." "Are you questioning my sources?" Janet's voice carried a warning I'd never heard before. The geologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks confirmed it personally. Equipment failure, nothing more. She handed me a new set of tapes. These are the corrected readings. File them appropriately and forget about the others. I looked at the replacement tapes. Perfect standard earthquake readings. Exactly what you'd expect from the China Lake event. No geometric patterns, no rhythmic pulses, no mathematical sequences, as if the anomalous readings had never existed at all. The next morning brought confirmation that something significant was happening, even if I didn't understand what yet. I arrived at the station to find chaos in the newsroom. Our morning show director, Marcus Webb, was packing between editing bays while barking orders at anyone within earshot. "Where's the Fairbanks package?" he demanded, stopping in front of my desk. The geology piece. It was supposed to be ready for the 8 a.m. show. I looked up from the equipment logs I'd been updating. What geology piece? The earthquake follow-up. Fairbanks sent us a segment yesterday evening about unusual readings in the Alaska monitoring stations. A local geologist went on camera discussing the anomalies. My pulse quickened. Someone else had seen what I'd seen. "Janet pulled it," came a voice from across the room. Tim Richardson, our weekend anchor, was sorting through a stack of videotapes. Said there were technical issues with the footage. Marcus stormed over to Janet's office, but she wasn't in yet. He returned 20 minutes later, looking frustrated and confused. "Anyone know where I can find this Fairbanks package?" "Misfiled," Tim said, not looking up from his tapes. At least that's what the overnight producer told me. Said it got mixed in with some promotional materials and accidentally bulk erased. Accidentally, these things happen, but I knew they didn't. Not like this. Not with footage that corroborated what I discovered in the seismograph readings. Video didn't just disappear from a professional news operation, especially not breaking news packages that had been specifically requested for broadcast. I spent my lunch break calling the Fairbanks affiliate, trying to get a copy of the original segment. The receptionist transferred me to 3 different departments before finally connecting me with someone who claimed to handle video archives. "We don't have any record of an earthquake anomaly story," the woman told me. "Are you sure you have the right date?" May 22nd, yesterday, a geologist discussing unusual seismograph readings. Let me check again. A long pause filled with keyboard clicking. "I'm sorry, but our only earthquake coverage from yesterday was a brief mention during the evening weather segment. Standard China Lake earthquake information, nothing about anomalies." After she hung up, I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to make sense of what was happening. Seismograph recordings didn't just malfunction in perfect geometric patterns. News segments didn't accidentally get erased hours before their scheduled broadcast. And archive departments didn't lose all record of stories that had been produced less than 24 hours earlier, unless someone wanted them to disappear. When I returned to the station, Janet was waiting at my desk with a folder marked Personnel Review. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing toward her office. The meeting lasted exactly 4 minutes. Janet explained that due to budget constraints, my position would be transitioning from full-time to part-time status. Fewer responsibilities, more focused duties, and significantly less access to incoming feeds and archive materials. Nothing personal, she assured me, though her eyes suggested otherwise. Just changing priorities. Does this have anything to do with the seismograph readings? Janet's expression hardened. "I told you to forget about that equipment malfunction. dwelling on minor technical issues isn't productive for anyone. What if it wasn't a malfunction? She stood up, clearly ending the conversation. Sometimes the best thing a junior technician can do is trust that his supervisors understand the bigger picture. Focus on your assigned duties, nothing more. As I left her office, I noticed a man in a gray suit sitting in the lobby. He was reading a newspaper, but his eyes followed me as I walked past. When I glanced back through the window, he was gone. That evening, I learned that the Fairbanks geologist, who had supposedly been interviewed about the anomalous readings, a Professor Elizabeth Hartman from the University of Alaska, had been transferred to a research position in Antarctica. According to the university's geology department, she'd left Alaska on an urgent research opportunity that morning. 24 hours after the most unusual seismic readings I'd ever documented, everyone involved had either been reassigned, relocated, or convinced that nothing unusual had happened at all. Everyone except me. Summer 1992, the reassignment came through official channels in early June. The Alaska Army National Guard needed civilian technical support for a summer geological survey project in the interior. Good pay, outdoor experience, and the chance to work with sophisticated monitoring equipment. Janet recommended me personally. Excellent opportunity for professional development, she said, handing me the paperwork. Military experience looks good on a resume. I should have been suspicious. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been demoted for asking too many questions. Now suddenly I was being recommended for a prestigious assignment with the National Guard. But I was 24 and broke, and the pay was 3 times what I was making at the television station. I signed the papers that afternoon. The briefing session took place at Elmendorf Air Force Base in a windowless room that smelled like industrial carpet and fresh paint. 27 civilian contractors, mostly technical specialists and equipment operators, sat in folding chairs while a lieutenant colonel explained our mission. Geological survey and magnetic anomaly mapping, he announced, clicking through slides of topographical maps. The U.S. Geological Survey, in cooperation with the Department of Defense, is conducting a comprehensive analysis of mineral resources and subsurface formations throughout the Tanana Valley region. The map showed a vast area of wilderness roughly 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks, rugged terrain, limited road access, and according to the briefing materials, significant potential for strategic mineral deposits. Your job is to maintain, calibrate, and monitor an array of sensitive instruments, the colonel continued. Magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, and electromagnetic field detectors. This equipment will provide data essential for mapping subsurface geology and identifying areas of scientific interest. It sounded legitimate, the kind of project the military would undertake to identify valuable resources on federal land. But something about the colonel's presentation felt rehearsed, as if he was reading from a script rather than explaining a mission. He opened for questions. A contractor in the back row raised his hand. What kind of minerals are we looking for specifically? Rare earth elements primarily, materials essential for modern electronics and defense applications. Any particular geological formations we should be aware of? The colonel hesitated for just a moment before answering. standard sedimentary and igneous formations typical of interior Alaska. Nothing unusual expected. Nothing unusual expected. That phrase would haunt me for years. We were transported to the survey site in military helicopters, flying low over endless miles of boreal forest and tundra. The base camp was more elaborate than I had anticipated. Dozens of green canvas tents, a communications trailer, generator stations, and a helicopter landing pad that could accommodate multiple aircraft simultaneously. This wasn't a typical geological survey. This was a military operation disguised as a scientific mission. My assignment was maintenance and calibration of the electromagnetic monitoring stations. 12 sophisticated units positioned in a rough circle around what the maps labeled as Survey Area Alpha. Each station contained equipment I'd never seen before, devices that looked more like something from a physics laboratory than standard geological instruments. The first anomalous readings appeared on my third day. I was checking the calibration on Station 7, located about 2 miles east of the main camp, when I noticed the electromagnetic sensors were detecting regular pulses from underground. Not random fluctuations or equipment noise, but steady rhythmic signals with a frequency of approximately 0.7 hertz, like a heartbeat, like something breathing beneath the earth. I ran diagnostics on the equipment, suspecting a malfunction. Everything checked out perfectly. The sensors were operating within normal parameters, accurately detecting electromagnetic pulses originating from somewhere deep below the surface. Sergeant Williams, I called out to my supervisor, a career Army engineer who'd been surprisingly helpful during my first few days. I'm getting some unusual readings on the M array. He walked over and studied the display screens, his expression growing more serious as he examined the data. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Started about an hour ago. Regular pulses, subsurface origin, consistent frequency." Williams made some notes in his field logbook, then spent several minutes adjusting settings and running his own diagnostics. "Equipment's working fine," he concluded. "Must be picking up some kind of geological phenomenon." "What kind of geological phenomenon generates regular electromagnetic pulses?" He closed his logbook and looked at me directly, the kind of look that meant he was giving me the first honest answer I'd received since arriving in Alaska, the kind we're here to study. That night, lying in my tent and listening to the generators humming in the distance, I realized that Sergeant Williams had given me the truth. We weren't here to survey for minerals or map geological formations. We were here to monitor something that was already known to exist, something that pulsed with mechanical regularity deep beneath the Alaskan wilderness. Something that had probably been responsible for the anomalous seismograph readings I discovered 3 months earlier at the television station. Over the following weeks, the electromagnetic readings grew stronger and more complex. What had started as simple pulses evolved into intricate patterns, sequences of signals that repeated every few hours with mathematical precision. I began keeping detailed logs, documenting frequency variations, amplitude changes, and the seemingly deliberate nature of the signal patterns. Other contractors started reporting similar anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar detected vast structural formations at depths that should have contained nothing but rock and sediment. Magnetometers recorded field disturbances that followed geometric arrangements. Seismic sensors picked up vibrations that sounded almost like machinery operating far underground. But whenever we tried to discuss our findings with supervisory personnel, we received the same response: log the data and continue monitoring. Analysis will be conducted at higher levels. By late July, it became clear that we weren't the first team to work this area. During a routine maintenance check at Station 11, I discovered survey markers that predated our mission by at least 5 years. Weathered metal stakes marked with coordinates and reference numbers, partially buried in the permafrost. Someone had been monitoring this region for a long time. Someone had known exactly what we would find. The discovery happened on August 15th during what should have been a routine equipment check. I was assigned to the night shift that week, monitoring the sensor array while the day crew focused on expanding the survey perimeter. It was lonely work, 6 hours alone with nothing but instrument panels and radio chatter from the main camp, but I'd grown to appreciate the solitude. The midnight hours in Alaska were never truly dark during summer, just a prolonged twilight that painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Station 9 had been acting up for 3 days, showing intermittent power fluctuations that didn't appear to have any mechanical cause. The generators were running smoothly, the cable connections were solid, and diagnostic tests showed all systems operating normally. But every few hours, the station would experience a brief power surge followed by a momentary blackout. Sergeant Williams had asked me to babysit the problem station overnight, documenting any irregularities and performing manual resets when necessary. Boring work, but it gave me time to study the data logs I'd been accumulating over the past month. The electromagnetic pulse patterns had become increasingly complex. What started as simple rhythmic signals had evolved into sequences that almost resembled coded transmissions, mathematical progressions, repeated intervals, and variations that suggested some kind of underlying intelligence. I was reviewing frequency analyses when the ground started vibrating. Not earthquake vibrations. I'd experienced enough of those during my time in Alaska to recognize the difference. This was more subtle, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from directly beneath the monitoring station. The vibrations lasted exactly 43 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. Station 9's equipment went crazy. Every sensor simultaneously spiked into the red zone. Electromagnetic readings jumped to levels I'd never seen before. The seismic detectors registered movement equivalent to a magnitude 3 earthquake, but only from this specific location. Ground-penetrating radar showed massive structural movement at depths approaching 200 feet. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything returned to normal. I radioed the main camp immediately, but the communications officer seemed unconcerned. "Probably just a minor tremor," he said. "Log it and continue monitoring." But I knew it wasn't a tremor. Earthquakes don't affect just one monitoring station while leaving others completely undisturbed. They don't create perfect geometric signatures on electromagnetic sensors, and they sure as hell don't last exactly 43 seconds with mechanical precision. An hour later, I saw lights moving on the restricted ridge. About half a mile north of Station 9, a steep hillside had been declared off-limits to survey personnel from the beginning of our mission. Official designation: geological hazard area, unstable slope conditions. We'd been instructed to stay at least 500 yards away from the base of the ridge and report any signs of erosion or rockfall activity. But now, at 2:30 in the morning, powerful floodlights were illuminating the entire slope. I grabbed the night vision binoculars from my equipment kit and focused on the ridge. Military vehicles, at least 4 heavy trucks and what looked like a bulldozer, were positioned around the base of the hill. Dozens of personnel moved back and forth in the artificial daylight, carrying equipment I couldn't identify. They appeared to be excavating something. For the next 3 hours, I watched them work. The bulldozer cleared away loose rock and debris, while teams of specialists used smaller tools to carefully expose whatever lay beneath. It was methodical, professional work that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. At 5:47 a.m., they uncovered it. Even through the binoculars, even at a distance of nearly half a mile, there was no mistaking what had been hidden beneath the collapsed slope. A smooth, triangular face of black material jutted from the hillside, not rough stone or natural rock formation, but a perfectly flat surface that seemed to absorb the floodlight beams rather than reflect them. The exposed section was roughly 20 feet wide at the base and extended upward into the hill at a precise geometric angle. It looked like the tip of something much larger buried beneath the ridge, something artificial, something deliberately constructed, something that had been generating electromagnetic pulses beneath the Alaskan wilderness. I fumbled for my camera, desperately trying to document what I was seeing. But by the time I managed to focus the telephoto lens, heavy canvas tarps were being stretched over the excavation site. Within minutes, the entire operation disappeared beneath military green coverings. The floodlights went out. The vehicles withdrew. By sunrise, the ridge looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived at Station 9 8 hours earlier, except now I knew what was hidden underneath. When Sergeant Williams arrived for the morning shift change, I tried to explain what I'd witnessed. He listened patiently while I described the excavation, the exposed black surface, and the obvious artificial nature of whatever lay buried in the ridge. "Interesting," he said when I finished my report, "but you were supposed to be monitoring Station 9, not conducting unauthorized surveillance of restricted areas." The lights were impossible to miss, and if there's some kind of structure buried out there, it might explain the electromagnetic anomalies we've been detecting. Williams made notes in his field logbook, just as he had when I'd first reported the unusual readings weeks earlier, but his expression suggested he was recording my observations rather than investigating them. "I'll pass your report up the chain of command," he assured me. "Meanwhile, I need you to focus on your assigned duties. The equipment monitoring is critical to our mission's success." But what about the excavation? Shouldn't we be coordinating with whoever was working on the ridge? "That's above your clearance level." His tone carried the same warning I'd heard from Janet Morrison months earlier at the television station. Sometimes the best thing a contractor can do is trust that the people in charge understand the bigger picture. I spent the rest of that morning reviewing my camera footage and detailed notes from the night shift. Everything I'd witnessed was carefully documented: timestamps, coordinates, descriptions of equipment and personnel, detailed observations of the exposed black surface, physical evidence that something extraordinary was buried beneath the Alaska wilderness. When I returned to Station 9 that evening, the restricted ridge had been completely transformed. Fresh dirt covered the excavation site. New warning signs marked the perimeter of the off-limits zone, and a guard post had been established at the base of the hill, manned by 2 soldiers who remained visible throughout the night. Lieutenant Torres, who supervised the evening security rotation, stopped by my monitoring station around midnight. "Any problems with the equipment tonight?" he asked. "Everything's running smoothly." "Good. By the way, yesterday's excavation work on the ridge was just routine geological sampling, foundation testing for a possible communications relay tower. Nothing that would affect your monitoring duties." He waited for me to acknowledge his explanation. "Understood," I said, but I didn't understand. Communications relay towers don't require exposing smooth black surfaces that absorb light. Geological sampling doesn't involve covering excavation sites with military tarps and posting armed guards. And foundation testing sure as hell doesn't explain electromagnetic pulse patterns that had been detected for months before any excavation began. 3 days later, I learned that my security clearance had been upgraded. Additional background checks, expanded access to classified materials, and a significant increase in my daily pay rate. I should have been excited about the promotion. Instead, I felt like I was being bought, and I was probably right. The warnings started trickling in during late August, passed along through the informal network of hunters, trappers, and bush pilots who made their living in the Alaska interior. Jerry Kowalski was the first to approach me directly. A hunting guide from Healy who'd been working the region for 15 years, he found me during a supply run to the nearest trading post and pulled me aside for a conversation that changed everything. "You boys are stirring up something that ought to be left alone," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Local folks are getting nervous." "Oh, what do you mean?" "Equipment failures, vehicles breaking down for no reason, compasses spinning like tops when you get within 5 miles of your operation." Jerry described incidents that had been occurring with increasing frequency since our survey mission began. Hunters reporting complete electrical system failures in their trucks after driving past our access roads. Bush pilots experiencing instrument malfunctions while flying over the Tanana Valley region. Even handheld GPS units and basic magnetic compasses becoming unreliable anywhere near our survey area. "Started about the same time you military boys showed up," he continued, "getting worse every week. You think our equipment is causing interference." Jerry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I've been around industrial operations my whole life. Mining camps, construction projects, military exercises. Never seen anything that could drain a truck battery from 2 miles away." He handed me a photograph, an aerial shot of the valley taken from his small plane the previous week. In the image, our survey stations were clearly visible as small dots arranged in what appeared to be a perfect circle around the restricted ridge. 12 stations, Jerry said. Equal spacing, mathematical precision. That's not how you set up equipment for mineral surveys. He was right. Standard geological surveys used irregular patterns based on topographical features and suspected resource locations. Our array looked more like something designed to monitor or contain a specific area. What do you think we're really doing out there? Jerry studied my face for a long moment before answering. Same thing the government's been doing in Alaska for decades, poking around in places that ought to be left alone. Over the next 2 weeks, I began seeking out other locals who might have information about unusual activities in the region. What I discovered was a pattern of strange incidents dating back years before our current mission. Margaret Yates, who operated a small airfield near Nenana, remembered military helicopters conducting nighttime flights to the Tanana Valley throughout the late 1980s. Always the same destination, always carrying equipment and personnel, always operating under radio silence. They'd fuel up here sometimes, she told me. Never talked to anyone, never explained where they were going, but they always flew to the same coordinates and they always came back before dawn. Tom Bradley, a trapper who'd been working the region since the 1970s, described discovering survey markers and abandoned equipment caches years before any official geological mission had been announced. Found metal stakes with government markings back in '87, he said. Somebody was mapping that area long before you boys showed up. Most disturbing were the accounts from native residents of nearby villages. Elders spoke of the hum beneath the earth that had been growing stronger over the past decade. Traditional hunting grounds where caribou and other wildlife had begun avoiding certain areas. Stories passed down through generations about the thing that sleeps under the ice. Lana Tutu, a respected elder from the village of Minto, agreed to meet with me after hearing about my questions from other community members. My grandfather told stories about that place, she said, long before any white men came to Alaska. There was something buried in the earth, something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. What kind of something? Lana looked toward the distant mountains where our survey mission was operating. He called it the star that fell and stayed, said it was older than the ice, older than the trees, said the shamans used to keep people away from that place because it could change the way you think. The change how? Make you forget what's real, make you see things that aren't there, make you believe lies were truth. I thought about the months I'd spent documenting anomalous readings only to have supervisors explain them away as equipment malfunctions. The seismograph recordings that had been replaced with corrected versions. The news segments that had disappeared from archive systems. Make you believe lies were truth. The old stories say it would call to certain people, Anna continued. Draw them closer, make them want to dig it up and set it free. Unset what free? Whatever's been sleeping under the ground all this time. As summer turned toward autumn, the reports from local residents became increasingly alarming. Commercial pilots were reporting instrument failures and navigation problems over a widening area around our survey site. The Alaska State Troopers received multiple complaints about electronic device malfunctions near what was supposed to be a routine geological survey. Most significantly, several hunting parties had reported visual phenomena that defied explanation. Dave Richardson and his son Michael were bow hunting for moose about 8 miles south of our operation when they witnessed what Dave described as lights moving underground. Not surface lights, he emphasized when I interviewed him at his home in Fairbanks. These were coming from beneath the forest floor, geometric patterns moving in straight lines, like somebody was running electric cables under the trees. How long did this last? About 20 minutes, then everything went dark and our truck wouldn't start. Batteries were completely drained. Michael, who was studying electrical engineering at the University of Alaska, had brought a digital camera on the hunting trip. When they tried to review the photographs later, every image taken during the time period when they'd witnessed the underground lights had been corrupted. Not just overexposed or blurry, Michael explained. The files were there, but they contained nothing but static patterns, like something had scrambled the digital data. By September, enough local residents had experienced unusual phenomena that the issue reached the attention of state government offices in Anchorage. According to Jerry Kowalski, who had contacts in the Alaska legislature, several state representatives had submitted formal inquiries about military activities in the Tanana Valley region. The official response was always the same: routine geological survey operations conducted in cooperation with the U.S. Geological Survey. No classified activities, no unusual equipment, no cause for public concern. But the locals knew better. They'd seen the effects, witnessed the phenomena, and experienced the equipment failures that seemed to radiate outward from our survey area like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And some of them had begun to piece together the bigger picture. "You want to know what I think you boys found out there?" Jerry asked during our last conversation before I left Alaska. "I think you found something that's been buried for a long, long time. Something that maybe should have stayed buried." "What makes you say that?" "Because 40 years ago, my father was hunting in that same area when the Army first started poking around. Same kind of operation, same kind of secrecy. He said the old-timers back then called it feeding the thing in the ground, feeding it power, attention, people digging around and trying to wake it up." Jerry looked toward the mountains where our survey mission continued its work. "Problem is, some things are buried for a good reason. And once you start digging them up, you can't always put them back." As I prepared to leave Alaska and return to civilian life, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jerry's warning was more prophetic than I'd realized. We hadn't just discovered something extraordinary buried beneath the wilderness. We'd awakened it. The first sign that my civilian life wouldn't be returning to normal came 3 days after I arrived back in Anchorage. I'd returned to my old job at KTU Channel 2, accepting a significant pay cut and the same limited access that had been imposed before my National Guard assignment. Janet Morrison acted as if nothing unusual had happened, welcoming me back with professional courtesy and a stack of routine technical duties. But I wasn't the same person who'd left Alaska 4 months earlier. I'd seen too much, documented too many anomalies, and accumulated too much evidence to simply resume my old life, pretending that nothing extraordinary was happening beneath the Alaskan wilderness. My plan was simple: use the television station's archive resources to compile a comprehensive record of everything I'd discovered. Seismograph recordings, electromagnetic readings, photographic evidence, and testimonies from local residents. If I could document the pattern of unusual activities dating back to the 1980s, maybe I could piece together the full scope of whatever the government was trying to hide. The first obstacle appeared immediately. Station 9's data logs, the detailed records I'd maintained throughout the summer survey mission, were classified as government property and had been confiscated before I left the base camp. Standard procedure, according to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who supervised our mission debriefing. All documentation related to the geological survey falls under federal security protocols. contractor personnel are not authorized to retain copies of operational data. I'd expected this, which is why I'd hidden duplicate copies of my most important observations. Nothing official or comprehensive, just personal notes and sketches that I'd kept in my civilian gear rather than military-issued equipment. But when I unpacked my belongings at my apartment in Anchorage, those materials were missing too. The box containing my handwritten logs, electromagnetic frequency charts, and detailed sketches of the black surface I'd observed on the ridge had been replaced with standard National Guard paperwork, personnel evaluation forms, equipment checkout lists, and administrative materials that any contractor would be expected to possess. No evidence that I had witnessed anything unusual during my 4 months in the wilderness. I filed a formal complaint with the National Guard Administrative Office, claiming that my personal property had been accidentally switched with someone else's materials. The response came back within 48 hours, no record of any missing civilian property, and no other contractor personnel reporting similar issues. According to their files, I'd never maintained any personal documentation beyond standard administrative paperwork. My second attempt to reconstruct the evidence focused on the television station's archive system. KTU had been monitoring seismograph feeds from across Alaska for over a decade, and I was certain that other unusual readings had been recorded during the months preceding my National Guard assignment. But when I accessed the seismograph archives, I discovered that the files for July through September 1992 had been updated with a notation I'd never seen before, reprocessed per USNO guidance. Original data archived offsite. The corrected files contained exactly what I expected to find. Standard seismic readings with no unusual patterns, no geometric signatures, and no evidence of electromagnetic anomalies. Clean, normal data that showed nothing more interesting than routine earthquake activity and background geological noise. The original recordings I discovered back in May, the ones showing rhythmic pulses and mathematical sequences, had been completely replaced. "What's USNO?" I asked Janet Morrison during our weekly staff meeting. "United States Naval Observatory," she replied without looking up from her scheduling notes. "They provide technical guidance for precision timing and navigation systems. Sometimes they issue corrections for data that's been corrupted by equipment malfunctions." Equipment malfunctions. Civilian monitoring stations aren't always calibrated to military standards. The observatory helps ensure accuracy when federal agencies need reliable seismic data. Janet's explanation sounded reasonable, but it didn't address the fundamental question. Why would the Naval Observatory care about routine earthquake readings from Alaska television stations, unless those readings weren't routine at all? My investigation stalled completely in October when I attempted to contact the Fairbanks geologist who'd supposedly been interviewed about the seismograph anomalies, Professor Elizabeth Hartman, who had been transferred to Antarctica the day after the China Lake earthquake. According to the University of Alaska, Professor Hartman had never been employed by their geology department. No record of her teaching any classes, conducting research, or holding any position at the university. No academic publications, no research grants, no professional affiliations with any Alaska-based scientific institutions. Elizabeth Hartman had never existed. But someone had been interviewed by the Fairbanks television station about unusual seismic readings, someone with sufficient credentials to be presented as a local geology expert, someone whose segment had been scheduled for broadcast before mysteriously disappearing from the archive system. I spent weeks trying to identify who might have been interviewed, contacting geology departments throughout Alaska, and searching academic databases for researchers who might have been working in the region during 1992. Nothing. No geologist, no interview, no evidence that any news segment about seismic anomalies had ever been produced. Yet I distinctly remembered Tim Richardson mentioning the Fairbanks package and Marcus Webb searching for the missing footage. Either multiple people at the television station shared the same false memory, or we'd all witnessed evidence that had been systematically erased. The final piece of proof that my experiences were being actively suppressed came in November when I received an official notice from the Alaska Army National Guard. All personnel who had participated in the summer 1992 geological survey were required to attend a mandatory debriefing session at Elmendorf Air Force Base. Attendance was not optional, and failure to appear would result in legal action under the terms of our contractor agreements. 26 of the original 27 civilian contractors attended the session. The missing person, a magnetometer specialist named Carl Henderson, had been killed in a car accident 2 weeks after returning to civilian life. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes conducted the debriefing personally, explaining that some of our survey data had been misinterpreted by personnel without appropriate technical training. Electromagnetic readings that appeared anomalous were actually the result of solar storm activity and atmospheric interference. Ground-penetrating radar signatures that seemed artificial were caused by natural mineral deposits and geological formations. Everything we'd witnessed had a perfectly reasonable scientific explanation. Some of you may have observed excavation activities near restricted areas, Hayes continued. This was routine slope stabilization work to prevent erosion that could damage our monitoring equipment. He made eye contact with me specifically when he said this. All survey data remains classified for national security reasons. Personnel are reminded that their contractor agreements include permanent non-disclosure provisions regarding any activities observed during the mission. The meeting concluded with each contractor signing an updated security agreement. The document contained language I didn't remember from my original paperwork, specific clauses prohibiting public discussion of survey activities, with civil and criminal penalties for violations. When I raised questions about the revised terms, Hayes assured me that this was standard procedure for all government geological surveys. Nothing personal, he said, echoing Janet Morrison's words from months earlier. Just a change in security requirements. But as I signed the papers, I noticed that my original contractor file had been modified. According to the updated records, I'd been assigned to routine equipment maintenance duties throughout the mission. No mention of electromagnetic monitoring, no record of anomalous readings, no documentation of my reports about the excavation on the restricted ridge. My summer in the Alaska wilderness had been reduced to 4 months of mundane technical work with no unusual incidents, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened at all. Late 1990s, for 5 years after the debriefing, I tried to forget what I'd witnessed in the Tanana Valley. I focused on my work at the television station, avoided discussions about unusual seismic activity, and convinced myself that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had been right about misinterpreted data and natural explanations. But the whispers never stopped completely. They came through informal networks, conversations overheard in bars, rumors passed along by military personnel on leave, cryptic references in technical journals that hinted at classified research projects in remote locations. In 1997, I moved to Fairbanks and took a position with a private communications company that serviced rural Alaska. The work involved maintaining radio relay stations and satellite communication equipment throughout the interior, which gave me opportunities to travel through the same regions where I'd worked during my National Guard assignment. The Tanana Valley looked different now. New access roads, expanded helicopter landing areas, and permanent structures that hadn't existed during our 1992 survey mission. According to local residents, military activity in the region had increased significantly over the past few years. But when I tried to obtain information about current operations through official channels, I encountered the same bureaucratic walls that had frustrated me 5 years earlier. The area remained classified as an active geological research zone with restricted public access. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Roger Eastman, a retired Westinghouse engineer who'd spent 3 decades working on classified defense projects. I met Roger during a technical conference in Anchorage, where he was presenting research on electromagnetic field detection systems. After his presentation, we ended up sharing drinks at the hotel bar and discussing the challenges of maintaining sensitive equipment in Alaska's harsh environment. "You know," Roger said after his 3rd beer, "Cheyenne Mountain has NORAD, but Alaska has something much older. We're just plugging our systems into it." "Oh, what do you mean?" Roger glanced around the bar, making sure we weren't being overheard. "Ever hear of Project Deep Freeze?" "Well, I hadn't." 1950s, Antarctic research program officially, but there were parallel operations in Alaska that never made it into the public record. Government found something buried in the permafrost, something that had been there for a very long time. "What kind of something?" "Artificial structure, massive, pre-existing power generation capabilities that our best engineers couldn't explain." Roger finished his beer and signaled for another. Westinghouse got the contract to interface our monitoring systems with whatever the hell was already down there. "You're talking about the Tanana Valley region." Roger's expression sobered immediately. "I never mentioned any specific locations, and neither did you. But his confirmation was clear enough. For over 40 years, the U.S. government had been operating some kind of facility that utilized technology they didn't fully understand. Technology that had been discovered rather than developed. Technology that generated the electromagnetic pulses I'd monitored during the summer of 1992. Over the following months, I began documenting similar accounts from other retired defense contractors and former military personnel. Always the same pattern: classified projects involving pre-existing structures, technology that exceeded contemporary capabilities, and strict security protocols that prevented public disclosure. In 1999, I submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for any documents related to geological surveys, electromagnetic monitoring, or military activities in the Tanana Valley region between 1987 and 1995. The response arrived 8 months later, 247 pages of heavily redacted documents that contained virtually no useful information. Every significant detail had been blacked out under national security exemptions, leaving only basic administrative data like dates, personnel assignments, and equipment inventories. But even the censored documents revealed important patterns. Military operations in the region had been continuous since at least 1987, not sporadic survey missions as I'd been led to believe. Multiple federal agencies were involved, including the Department of Energy, NASA, and organizations I'd never heard of with acronyms that suggested advanced research activities. Most significantly, the equipment inventories listed sophisticated monitoring and communication systems that far exceeded what would be necessary for routine geological surveys. Power generation capabilities, satellite uplink systems, and electromagnetic field manipulation devices that suggested the kind of advanced research Roger Eastman had described. The government wasn't just studying whatever lay buried beneath the Alaska wilderness. They were actively using it. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to my P.O. box in Fairbanks with no return address and no postmark indicating its origin. I'd maintained the anonymous mail drop for 6 years, using it primarily for correspondence related to my ongoing research into the Alaska operations. Most of the mail consisted of responses to FOIA requests, academic papers related to electromagnetic phenomena, and occasional letters from other researchers who'd heard about my interest in unusual geological activities. But this package was different. No return address, no postal markings, and a weight that suggested something more substantial than typical correspondence. When I opened it at home, I found a single aerial photograph with a handwritten note attached. The image showed the Tanana Valley region from an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet. Someone had used a red pencil to mark specific locations throughout the valley, 12 points arranged in a perfect circle around the restricted ridge where I'd witnessed the excavation 11 years earlier. The marked locations corresponded exactly to the monitoring stations our survey team had established during the summer of 1992, but this photograph hadn't been taken during our mission. The image clearly showed permanent structures, access roads, and facilities that hadn't existed when I was working in the region. According to the date stamp in the corner, the photograph had been taken less than 6 months earlier. The handwritten note was brief. Energy is not created. It is channeled. Keep quiet. No signature, no identification of the sender, no explanation of how they'd obtained my mailing address or why they'd chosen to share this information with me. But the message was clear enough. Someone with access to recent surveillance data wanted me to understand that the operations I'd witnessed were part of a much larger and ongoing project. I studied the photograph for hours, using magnifying equipment to examine every detail. The permanent structures included what appeared to be a substantial underground facility with only ventilation systems and communication equipment visible at the surface level, multiple helicopter landing areas, underground power lines, and security installations that suggested a major military operation. This wasn't a research station or monitoring facility. This was a full-scale industrial complex built around whatever lay buried beneath the ridge. 3 days after receiving the photograph, I was contacted by a man who identified himself only as a government liaison. He called while I was at work, somehow obtaining my direct office number, despite the fact that my employment with the communications company wasn't a matter of public record. "We need to meet," he said without preamble. "Tonight, 7:00 p.m. the parking lot behind the Westmark Hotel." Who is this?" "Someone who can help you understand your situation." "What situation?" "The one that's been developing since you started asking questions about geological surveys and electromagnetic monitoring." The line went dead before I could respond. I should have ignored the call. Every instinct warned me that meeting with anonymous government contacts was dangerous, especially given my history with classified operations and security agreements. But I'd been searching for answers for over a decade. This might be my only opportunity to learn the truth about what I'd witnessed in the Alaska wilderness. The man was waiting in a dark sedan when I arrived at the hotel parking lot. He gestured for me to get in the passenger seat, but kept the engine running throughout our conversation. "You received a package this week," he said. It wasn't a question. "Oh, yes." "Interesting photograph. Someone obviously wants you to understand that your 1992 experiences were part of a larger operation." "Are they?" He handed me a manila envelope. "There are 2 ways this conversation can end. Option 1, you accept a consulting fee of $50,000, sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and relocate outside Alaska within 60 days. And Option 2. Option 2 involves a much more complicated legal situation that wouldn't be pleasant for anyone involved." I opened the envelope. It contained a cashier's check made out to my name, along with a stack of legal documents that appeared to be updated security agreements with significantly more restrictive terms than anything I'd signed previously. What exactly am I agreeing not to discuss? Geological phenomena that could be misinterpreted by the public, national security activities that require operational security, research projects that might be misunderstood without appropriate scientific context. Research into what? The man studied my face in the dim light from the dashboard. How much do you really want to know? Because once you cross that line, there's no going back to your normal life. I thought about the past 11 years, the missing data, the revised records, the systematic erasure of everything I'd witnessed during my National Guard assignment. The electromagnetic pulses that defied explanation, the black surface that absorbed light, and the whispered warnings from local residents about things that should be left buried. I want to know the truths. He reached into his jacket and handed me a second set of documents. These weren't security agreements or legal contracts, but photocopied pages from what appeared to be scientific reports. The structure under the ridge is approximately 900 feet long, he said as I scanned the documents. Triangular cross-section composed of materials that don't match any known geological formations. Carbon dating suggests it's been there for at least 12,000 years. 12,000 years, long before any known civilization had the technology to construct something like this. The electromagnetic pulses you monitored are generated by systems we still don't understand. Power output equivalent to a small nuclear reactor, but no identifiable energy source. I read through the scientific reports, trying to comprehend the implications of what he was telling me. The structure wasn't just large, it was massive, larger than any pyramid ever built by human civilization, buried beneath the Alaska wilderness for millennia. Well, what is it? We don't know, but we've been learning how to use it. He explained that the government had been channeling the structure's energy output to power classified research facilities throughout Alaska and northwestern Canada. The monitoring stations I'd helped establish were part of a grid system that regulated and directed the electromagnetic pulses for military and scientific applications. Free energy, he continued. Clean, unlimited, and completely undetectable by conventional monitoring systems. It's revolutionizing everything from satellite communications to advanced weapons research. And the people who live in the region, the equipment failures, the health effects. Unacceptable risks for a project of this magnitude. The casual dismissal of civilian safety was disturbing, but not surprising given the scope of the operation he was describing. If the government had discovered a source of unlimited energy, they would certainly prioritize military applications over public welfare. Why are you telling me this? Because you've been persistent enough to become a security risk, but smart enough to be useful. We need technical personnel who understand both the capabilities and the security requirements of this project. He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. Think about it for 48 hours, then call that number and let us know your decision. Accept the consulting fee and relocation offer, or become part of something much bigger than anything you've imagined. As I left the parking lot that night, I realized that my search for answers had led to a choice I'd never anticipated. I could take the money, sign the agreements, and spend the rest of my life pretending that nothing extraordinary existed beneath the Alaska wilderness. Or I could join the people who were actively exploiting whatever lay buried in the permafrost, regardless of the consequences for the world above. I never called the number. Instead, I kept the photograph and destroyed everything else: the check, the legal documents, and the business card with its anonymous contact information. Within a week, my PO box was burglarized and my office computer was stolen during a break-in that police described as random vandalism. The message was clear: cooperation or silence were my only options. I chose silence but not surrender. For the past 20 years, I've continued monitoring the situation from a distance. Small news items about equipment failures near the Tanana Valley, occasional reports of unusual seismic activity in interior Alaska, academic papers discussing electromagnetic anomalies that are quickly withdrawn from publication. The signs are always the same. Something massive continues operating beneath the Alaska wilderness, generating power and pulses that ripple through the surrounding region like a heartbeat under the earth. The government's cover stories have evolved over the decades. Geological surveys became climate research stations, which became renewable energy projects, which became atmospheric monitoring facilities. But the fundamental operation remains unchanged: a massive artificial structure of unknown origin providing unlimited energy for classified military applications. Local residents still report the same phenomena I witnessed during my National Guard assignment. Electronic devices failing without explanation, compasses spinning uselessly, and the persistent low-frequency hum that seems to emanate from deep underground. Lana was right about the old stories. Something sleeps beneath the ice, something older than human civilization, something that was never meant to be disturbed, but we've been disturbing it for over half a century now, feeding it our attention and technology, learning to harness its power for purposes its builders never intended. And with each passing year, the electromagnetic pulses grow stronger, the affected area grows larger, and the hum beneath the earth grows more insistent. Sometimes, when commercial flights pass over the region at night, passengers report seeing geometric patterns of light moving beneath the forest canopy. Airlines dismiss these sightings as atmospheric phenomena or aurora activity, but I know better. Those lights are coming from the structure itself, radiating upward through hundreds of feet of rock and permafrost, marking the boundaries of something that extends far beyond what any government survey has officially acknowledged. The Alaska Black Pyramid, because that's what it is, regardless of what the scientists and engineers choose to call it, isn't just a source of free energy. It's a machine, a device, a technology so advanced that we're still just scratching the surface of its capabilities after decades of study. And after 20 years of silence, I'm finally ready to speak. They buried the evidence, relocated the witnesses, and rewrote the official records. But they couldn't erase what thousands of Alaska residents have experienced firsthand. They couldn't suppress every photograph, silence every contractor, or explain away every electromagnetic anomaly. The truth is still there, humming beneath the permafrost, generating power for projects we're not supposed to know about, radiating effects that grow stronger every year. Something larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza sleeps under Alaska, and it's been awake for a very long time. What if I told you that the road to a sustainable future is actually a carefully paved path toward total control? Tonight, we dive into one of the most unsettling conspiracy theories of our time, the truth behind Agenda 2030 and the Operation Sustainable Transition. But first, make sure to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories, and leave your video ideas in the comments below. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I found, and what it cost me to share it with the world. 6 months ago, I was just another face in the cubicle farm, a mid-level data analyst working for Meridian Consulting, a contractor specializing in processing documentation for various United Nations partner agencies. It was boring work, the kind that pays the bills but doesn't exactly inspire water-cooler conversations. My job was simple. Take massive folders of open-source documents related to sustainable development goals and organize them into digestible reports for policymakers. Climate data, poverty statistics, education metrics, all the dry stuff that makes the world go round, theoretically. I'd been doing it for 3 years, long enough to recognize patterns and long enough to know when something didn't belong. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was working through my usual queue of files when a new folder appeared in my secure inbox, SDG Compliance Phase 3 Internal Use Only. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded at 3:47 a.m., which struck me as odd. Most documentation came through during business hours, properly labeled and categorized. Protocol dictated that any file marked internal use only should be forwarded to my supervisor without opening. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and I'd always been too curious for my own good. The folder contained 47 documents, mostly PDFs with official UN letterheads. At first glance, they looked legitimate: charts, graphs, policy recommendations. But as I scrolled through the first document, something felt wrong. The language was different from the usual bureaucratic speak. Instead of vague references to sustainable urban development, I found detailed maps showing what were labeled as population consolidation zones. Major cities were divided into colored sections. Green zones marked compliant residential areas. Yellow zones labeled transition monitoring required, and red zones ominously tagged relocation priority. My hands trembled as I opened the second document. It was a spreadsheet titled Behavioral Compliance Credits, Phase 3 Implementation. Each row represented a different category of human activity: private vehicle ownership, meat consumption, energy usage, travel frequency. Next to each category were point values, negative numbers that would be deducted from something called a citizenship score. The third document made my stomach drop. There was a timeline, meticulously planned and color-coded, with one phrase repeated at the top of every page: target year 2030. The timeline started in 2025 with Phase 1, infrastructure digitization, banking systems, identification cards, payment processing. Everything would be converted to digital platforms with mandatory government oversight. Phase 2, scheduled for 2027, was labeled voluntary compliance incentivization. Tax breaks and social benefits would be tied to behavior modification programs. But Phase 3, set for 2029, sent chills down my spine: mandatory compliance enforcement. Citizens who failed to meet behavioral standards would lose access to housing subsidies, food distribution networks, and healthcare services. The document coldly referred to this as natural selection through administrative channels. I found myself reading the same sentences over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. The United Nations was supposed to be about humanitarian aid and international cooperation, not population control and behavioral manipulation. But the documents were too detailed, too specific to be fake. They referenced real programs I'd seen in previous reports: smart city initiatives in Toronto, digital identity pilots in Amsterdam, carbon credit systems being tested in Singapore. All of it was presented as voluntary, progressive, and environmentally conscious. But according to these files, it was all preparation for something much darker. The final document in the folder was a memo dated just 2 weeks earlier. It was addressed to regional coordination directors and signed by someone with the title Under Secretary for Compliance Architecture. The subject line read, "Accelerated Timeline Approval, Operation Sustainable Transition." Colleagues, it began, recent global events have provided us with an unprecedented opportunity to advance our timeline. Public acceptance of monitoring and restriction measures has exceeded projections by 340%. We are therefore moving to implement Phase 3 protocols 18 months ahead of schedule. All regional coordinators should prepare their populations for the transition to mandatory compliance by Q4 2029. Remember, this is not about control. It is about survival. The planet cannot sustain current consumption patterns. We are the shepherds of a new era. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The cursor blinked in the search bar, waiting for my next move. Around me, my colleagues continued their work, oblivious to what I had stumbled across. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed suddenly oppressive, the click of keyboards ominous. I glanced at the clock. 11:23 a.m. In a few hours, I'd have to log this file in our system, noting what I'd reviewed and any relevant findings. But what exactly had I found? Evidence of the most elaborate conspiracy in human history, or the fevered imagination of someone with too much time and access to official letterhead templates. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, walked past my cubicle, coffee mug in hand. She smiled and nodded, the same greeting she'd given me every day for 3 years. Should I tell her what I'd found? Should I forward the files and let someone else make the decision? Instead, I did something that would change my life forever. I opened a new email and began typing. Janet, I've received a file folder that appears to be outside my clearance level. The documents reference programs and timelines that I believe require senior review. Should I forward this to you? Or is there a specific protocol for handling classified materials that I'm not aware of? Please advise. Mark. I read the email 3 times before hitting send. It was professional, cautious, and documented my discovery without making accusations. If this was all legitimate, I followed proper channels. If it wasn't, well, at least I'd have a paper trail showing I'd tried to do the right thing. The email showed as delivered at 11:31 a.m. I saved the documents to a secure folder on my desktop and logged out for lunch, trying to act normal despite the growing knot in my stomach. When I returned from my sandwich and a walk around the block, Janet hadn't responded to my email. That wasn't unusual. She often got caught up in meetings and didn't check messages until late afternoon. But as the day wore on and 5:00 p.m. approached, I began to worry. At 5:47 p.m., my computer chimed with a new message, but it wasn't from Janet. It was an automated system notification. File access revoked. Classification updated to restricted. Contact administrator for additional information. When I tried to open the folder containing the documents, I got an error message. Access denied. Insufficient privileges. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. Then I packed up my things, said goodnight to the security guard, and drove home with one thought echoing in my head. What the hell had I just gotten myself into? That night, I barely slept. Every car that drove past my apartment seemed to slow down. Every creak of the building settling made me jump. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I'd simply stumbled across some routine planning documents that were above my pay grade. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and someone, somewhere, now knew that I'd seen it. I arrived at work the next morning 15 minutes early, hoping to catch Janet before the day got busy. Her office was dark, which wasn't unusual. She typically arrived around 9:00 a.m., preferring to avoid rush hour traffic. I settled into my cubicle and tried to focus on routine tasks while waiting for her response to my email. At 9:30, Janet still hadn't arrived. Her assistant, Maria, seemed unconcerned when I asked about her whereabouts. She had an early meeting downtown, Maria said without looking up from her computer. Something about a new contract. She'll probably be in after lunch. But Janet never showed up that day or the next. By Thursday, Maria was fielding calls from confused clients and increasingly worried family members. Family emergency, she kept saying, but her voice lacked conviction. She'll be back early next week. That's when I noticed my computer had been acting strangely. Programs were loading slower than usual, and several files I'd been working on had vanished from my desktop. When I tried to access my email archives, I discovered that my entire inbox from the previous week had been deleted, including my message to Janet. The IT department claimed it was a routine system update that had caused some data loss, but they couldn't explain why only certain files were affected or why the deletion seemed to target specific date ranges. "These things happen," the technician said with a shrug. "That's why we tell everyone to back up important files." But I hadn't lost everything. Hidden in a rarely used folder buried deep in my directory structure, I found fragments of the documents I'd viewed. Not the complete files, but screenshots I'd taken without realizing it when my screen capture software had malfunctioned the day I first opened the folder. The images were partial and pixelated, but they showed enough to confirm that I hadn't imagined it all. Population consolidation zones, behavioral compliance credits, the 2030 target date. I was studying these fragments when my cubicle neighbor, Tom Rivera, leaned over the partition that separated our workstations. Tom was a junior analyst who'd started 6 months after me. We'd shared coffee breaks and complained about deadline pressures, but we weren't particularly close. "Hey," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Can I ask you something weird?" I minimized my screen and nodded. "Did you happen to see anything strange in your files last week?" Like documents that seemed out of place, the question sent a chill through me. "What kind of document?" Tom looked around again, then rolled his chair closer. "I got this folder by mistake, I think. Had all these maps and charts about moving people around, controlling where they could live and work. Really creepy stuff." "What did you do with it?" "Forwarded it to my supervisor, just like protocol says." But then, he paused, lowering his voice even further. "Then my supervisor disappeared, just like Janet. And this morning my computer was completely wiped, like everything. They gave me some story about a virus, but I know that's not what happened." We stared at each other for a moment, both understanding that we'd stumbled into something much larger than either of us had realized. "Listen," Tom continued. "I printed out a few pages before I forwarded the files. You know, just in case my supervisor had questions about the content. I still have them at home." "Tom, if what we saw is real, then we're probably in serious trouble just for talking about it." He glanced at the empty supervisor offices. "Look, I'm getting scared. First the files, then the disappearances, now the data wipes. Someone really doesn't want us to know what we saw. I made a decision that would haunt me for months. Meet me for coffee after work. The place on 5th Street, across from the library. We need to figure out what's going on." The rest of the day crawled by. I couldn't concentrate on my assigned tasks, constantly checking over my shoulder and jumping every time someone walked past my cubicle. At lunch, I took a walk to the local print shop and made copies of the screenshot fragments I'd found, storing the originals in a safety deposit box I'd opened on impulse. When 5:00 p.m. finally arrived, I packed up quickly and headed for the coffee shop. Tom was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He looked like he hadn't slept much. "This is crazy," he said as I sat down. "I keep thinking we should just drop it, pretend we never saw anything. But we did see it, and people are disappearing." Tom nodded grimly and slid a manila folder across the table. "I printed these Tuesday night before everything went to hell." The folder contained 8 pages of documents similar to what I'd seen. Maps of major cities divided into colored zones, a budget allocation chart for something called voluntary relocation assistance programs. Most disturbing was a page titled Resistance Mitigation Strategies, which outlined plans for dealing with what it called non-compliant population segments. "Look at the dates," Tom said, pointing to timestamps in the corner of each page. "These were created last month, but they reference events scheduled for next year. It's like they're planning everything in advance." "Planning what exactly?" Tom pulled out his phone and opened a news app. "I've been researching all day. Look at this." He showed me article after article about new government initiatives, mandatory digital health passes, carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, smart city infrastructure projects that included extensive surveillance networks. "Every single one of these programs is mentioned in the documents we saw," he said. "But in the news, they're presented as separate, voluntary initiatives for public safety and environmental protection. Nobody's talking about how they all connect." I thought about the timeline I'd seen, the careful progression from voluntary compliance to mandatory enforcement. What if they're not separate initiatives? What if it's all part of a larger plan? Tom's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "What is it?" Text from an unknown number. He showed me the message. "Stop digging or join your supervisors." He sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Tom stood up abruptly. "I'm done. This is too dangerous." "Tom, wait. No, I should never have gotten involved. I'm going home, and tomorrow I'm requesting a transfer to a different department. I suggest you do the same." He left the folder on the table and walked out, leaving me alone with documents that could either be the ravings of a conspiracy theorist or evidence of the largest social engineering project in human history. I walked home through streets that suddenly seemed full of cameras and sensors, wondering if I was being watched, if every step was being recorded and analyzed by systems I was only beginning to understand. When I got to my apartment, I found a note taped to my door, package delivered to management office, but I hadn't ordered anything. And when I checked with the building manager, there was no package waiting for me. The note was dated that morning, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. That night, I made another impulsive decision. I drove to an internet cafe on the other side of town and used a public computer to create anonymous email accounts on several platforms. Then I uploaded the documents Tom had given me, along with my screenshot fragments, to multiple cloud storage services. If something happened to me, at least there would be a record. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that I'd been marked from the moment I opened that first folder. In my rearview mirror, I noticed the same dark sedan that had been behind me when I left the coffee shop. It followed me all the way home. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every sound in the hallway outside my apartment sent me to the window, peering through blinds at empty streets that somehow felt full of hidden watchers. Tom didn't show up for work the next day or the day after that. His desk was cleared out by the weekend, and when I asked Maria about it, she said he'd requested an immediate transfer to pursue other opportunities. But I knew better. Tom had been scared, and scared people in our situation didn't get transfers. They got disappeared. With Janet gone and Tom relocated to who knows where, I was left alone with fragments of documents that painted a picture too terrifying to ignore and too dangerous to pursue. But I had to know more. If this was real, if there truly was a coordinated plan to reshape society by 2030, then someone needed to document it. I began my research carefully, using public library computers and paying cash for internet access at various cafes around the city. I created a simple methodology. Cross-reference the terms and programs mentioned in the leaked documents with publicly available information, looking for patterns and connections that might confirm or refute what I'd seen. The results were more disturbing than I'd expected. Smart city gateways was mentioned in 17 different documents I glimpsed. A quick search revealed that Toronto had announced a partnership with a tech consortium to implement exactly such a system by 2026. The project would integrate biometric identification, real-time location tracking, and automated behavioral assessment into a single platform designed to optimize urban resource distribution. The public announcement described it as a voluntary program to help residents access services more efficiently. But buried in the technical specifications, I found references to compliance monitoring algorithms and automated privilege adjustment protocols. Amsterdam's digital citizenship pilot was even more explicit. Citizens who participated would receive carbon credits for demonstrating environmentally conscious behavior, measured through smartphone tracking, purchase monitoring, and periodic check-ins at verification stations throughout the city. The credits could be used for transportation discounts, housing assistance, and priority access to health care. But what happened to citizens who didn't participate or who failed to meet behavioral targets? The program documentation was vague about consequences, mentioning only alternative pathways for non-participating residents. Singapore's implementation was the most advanced. Their sustainable living credit system had been operational for 8 months, and earlier reports claimed impressive results: 67% reduction in private vehicle usage, 45% decrease in meat consumption, and 89% compliance with residential energy limitations. I found a blog post from a Singapore resident that painted a different picture. The author, writing under an obvious pseudonym, described a society where every purchase, every journey, every social interaction was monitored and scored. Citizens who failed to maintain adequate sustainability ratings found themselves locked out of public transportation, unable to access certain stores, and restricted to specific residential areas. It started as incentives, the blogger wrote. Green points for taking the bus, bonus credits for eating plant-based meals, rewards for staying in your assigned district. But the incentives became requirements so gradually that most people didn't notice the transition. Now, if your score drops too low, you simply can't function in society. And raising your score requires complete submission to the system's behavioral demands. The post had been published 3 weeks ago. When I tried to access it again the next day, the entire blog had been removed. I began compiling a spreadsheet of every program, initiative, and policy mentioned in the leaked documents, then researching whether similar real-world implementations existed. The results were consistent and terrifying. Every single item had a corresponding program either already active or scheduled for implementation within the next 2 years. Carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, announced by the European Central Bank for rollout in 2026. Biometric checkpoints for access to essential services, pilot programs active in 12 major cities worldwide. Residential assignment based on compliance scores, being tested in 3 countries under the guise of efficient housing allocation. Digital identity requirements for all online activities, legislation pending in multiple jurisdictions to combat misinformation and ensure digital safety. The pattern was unmistakable. What appeared to be separate, well-intentioned programs were actually components of a comprehensive system designed to monitor, control, and modify human behavior on a global scale. And they were all scheduled to reach full implementation by 2030. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the organizational structure behind these initiatives. Many of the programs were funded through the same consortium of international organizations, tech companies, and government agencies. The same names appeared on advisory boards and implementation committees across different countries and continents. One name appeared particularly frequently: the Sustainable Future Institute, a think tank founded in 2019 with substantial backing from several major philanthropic foundations. Their published research covered everything from climate change mitigation to urban planning optimization. All of it sounded reasonable and beneficial, but when I dug deeper, I found connections to government contracts for surveillance technology, behavioral modification research, and something called population management systems architecture. The Institute's founder, a former UN administrator named Dr. Catherine Voss, had given speeches advocating for necessary sacrifices in individual autonomy to ensure species survival. In a 2023 interview, she'd said, "Democracy and freedom are luxuries we can no longer afford. The climate crisis requires coordinated action on a scale that voluntary compliance cannot achieve. We must be willing to accept temporary limitations on personal choice in service of permanent solutions to existential threats." Temporary limitations. I wondered if the people implementing these systems really believed they would be temporary, or if they knew exactly what they were building: a global cage disguised as environmental salvation. As weeks passed, my research expanded beyond simple correlation. I began mapping the financial relationships between organizations, tracking personnel movements between government agencies and private companies, documenting the timeline of policy implementations across different countries. What emerged was a picture of unprecedented coordination. The same small group of organizations was driving policy changes on every continent, using local governments as implementation vehicles for a globally designed system. But I was still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The documents Tom and I had seen referenced enforcement mechanisms that went beyond social credit scores and access restrictions. They mentioned relocation programs, resource rationing, and something ominously called population optimization protocols. I needed more information, but I was running out of safe ways to obtain it. My library research had attracted attention. I'd noticed the same security guard watching me during several visits, and the librarian had started asking unusual questions about my research topics. It was during one of these library sessions that everything changed. I was printing articles about digital identity legislation when someone approached my table. A woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, with a composed demeanor that suggested either corporate management or government service. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help noticing your research interests. Would you be interested in information that might fill in some gaps?" Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but she held up a folder that looked remarkably similar to the ones Tom and I had found. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said, sitting down without invitation. "Until 6 months ago, I was a sustainability coordinator for the United Nations Development Program, and I think we need to talk." Elena insisted we meet somewhere more private. She suggested a small cafe in the Arts District, the kind of place that played acoustic music loud enough to mask conversation and served coffee in mismatched cups to customers who minded their own business. I arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where we could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. Elena appeared exactly on time, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be undone. "Before we begin," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to share will put both of us in danger. Once you know this information, there's no going back to ignorance, no pretending you never heard it." I nodded, though part of me wanted to walk away. The smart thing would have been to thank her politely and leave, to find a new job in a different field, and spend the rest of my life pretending I'd never seen those documents. But I stayed. Elena opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "You've been researching the sustainability initiatives, the smart city programs, the digital identity requirements. You're trying to understand how they all connect. How do you know what I've been researching? Because I helped design the connection points." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "I spent 4 years working on what we called the Integrated Sustainability Platform. My job was to ensure that all the separate programs could interface with each other, share data, and coordinate responses." The documents she showed me were similar to what I'd seen before, but far more detailed. Organizational charts that mapped relationships between dozens of agencies and corporations, technical specifications for data sharing protocols, implementation timelines that showed how voluntary programs would transition to mandatory compliance. "The public face of Agenda 2030 is real," Elena continued. "The Sustainable Development Goals, the climate initiatives, the poverty reduction programs, all of that is genuine and necessary. But there's another layer. A coordinated system that uses these worthy goals as justification for unprecedented social control." She pointed to a document labeled Phase Architecture Overview. It showed 3 distinct implementation stages, exactly matching what I'd seen in the linked files. Phase 1 focused on infrastructure development, get people comfortable with digital systems, establish the technical framework for monitoring and control. Most of this phase was already complete. Phase 2 was incentivization, make compliance attractive through benefits and rewards while gradually increasing the social and economic costs of non-participation. "We're in the middle of this phase now." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "Phase 3 is enforcement. By 2030, the system becomes mandatory. Citizens who don't comply lose access to banking, healthcare, housing assistance, and employment. It's designed to make non-compliance practically impossible." I studied the documents, trying to process the implications, but surely people would resist. There would be protests, political opposition. That's been planned for too. Elena flipped to a section titled Public Acceptance Strategies. It outlined a comprehensive approach to managing public opinion through media partnerships, social media manipulation, and strategic crisis deployment. "Every potential objection has been anticipated and countered," she said. "Privacy concerns are dismissed as selfish in the face of climate emergency. Economic fears are addressed through promises of universal basic income tied to compliance. Religious or cultural objections are characterized as dangerous extremism." She showed me polling data that tracked public acceptance of various control measures over time. The numbers were sobering. Support for digital identity requirements had grown from 23% to 67% in just 2 years, driven by concerns about online security and misinformation. Acceptance of carbon credit systems had increased even more dramatically after several high-profile climate disasters. People want to do the right thing, Elena said. They want to help save the planet and protect their communities. The system exploits that desire, channeling genuine concern into acceptance of comprehensive control. If this is all true, why did you leave? And why are you talking to me? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. I left because I realized what we were really building. I told myself for years that we were creating tools to address genuine crises, that temporary restrictions on freedom were justified by the urgent need for coordinated action. But the restrictions were never meant to be temporary, were they? The people at the top, the ones making the real decisions, they genuinely believe that democracy and individual liberty are obstacles to human survival. They see free choice as a luxury we can't afford, personal autonomy as a threat to species-level coordination. She opened another section of the folder, revealing documents that made my stomach turn. Plans for optimal population distribution that involved moving millions of people from rural areas into monitored urban zones. Resource allocation models that determined individual caloric allowances based on productivity scores. Educational restructuring programs designed to align personal goals with collective necessities. This isn't just about environmental protection, Elena continued. It's about fundamentally restructuring human society. The climate crisis provided the justification. The real goal is creating what they call sustainable civilization, a managed society where every aspect of human behavior is optimized for collective outcomes, and everyone just goes along with it. Most people never see the whole picture. They only interact with their small piece of the system, their local digital ID program, their neighborhood carbon credit initiative, their workplace compliance monitoring. Each component seems reasonable in isolation. Elena showed me internal communications between program coordinators in different countries. The language was bureaucratic and sanitized, but the content was chilling. Updates on resistance containment strategies, reports on compliance acceleration techniques, and budget requests for population management infrastructure. The coordinators don't communicate directly about control or oppression, she explained. They use euphemisms like behavioral optimization and resource management efficiency. Most of them probably believe they're working on humanitarian projects, but you knew better. I figured it out gradually as I gained access to higher-level planning documents. By the time I understood what we were really building, I was already deeply involved. Leaving wasn't easy. They don't let people with my level of knowledge simply resign. She glanced around the cafe nervously. I've been in hiding for 6 months, moving between safe houses, trying to gather evidence that could expose the true scope of the program. Why haven't you gone to the media? Elena laughed bitterly. With what? Documents that can be dismissed as forgeries, claims that sound like conspiracy theories. The system is too large and too coordinated for traditional journalism to expose. By the time reporters could verify the connections and compile comprehensive evidence, the implementation would be complete. Then what's the solution? Documentation, preservation. We need to create a record that can't be suppressed or discredited. When people finally realize what's happened, they'll need proof that it was planned, that it wasn't just a series of unfortunate coincidences or well-intentioned policies gone wrong. Elena closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. That's why I approached you. Your research shows that you understand the connections, and you're not in a position where disappearing you would draw unwanted attention. The casual way she mentioned my potential disappearance sent chills through me. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help me compile a comprehensive archive of evidence, documents, communications, financial records, implementation timelines, everything we can gather to prove that this was a coordinated plan rather than organic policy development. And then what? Then we find a way to preserve that archive until people are ready to see the truth. Elena stood up, leaving the folder on the table. Think about it, but don't take too long. The implementation is accelerating, and opportunities to document it are disappearing. She walked away, leaving me alone with documents that confirmed my worst fears about the scope and coordination of what I'd discovered. As I packed the folder into my bag, I noticed that my hands were shaking. Outside the cafe, I looked for Elena, but she had already vanished into the crowd. I walked home through streets that seemed different now. Every camera and sensor a component of something larger and more threatening than I'd previously imagined. That night, I read through Elena's documents 3 times, cross-referencing them with my own research. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying, but it was also incomplete. We had proof of coordination and planning, but not enough to convince a skeptical public or overcome the sophisticated manipulation strategies the system employed. I made my decision while sitting in my apartment at 2:00 a.m., surrounded by papers that documented the systematic dismantling of human freedom in the name of planetary salvation. I was going to help Elena build her archive, whatever the cost, because if we didn't preserve the truth, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had looked like. Elena and I established a communication protocol using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous email accounts. We met weekly at different locations, libraries, parks, shopping centers, never the same place twice. She provided documents and insider knowledge. I contributed research skills and a growing network of contacts who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the sustainability programs. For 3 weeks, our collaboration produced results. We mapped the financial relationships between implementing organizations, documented the timeline of policy rollouts, and identified key personnel who moved between government agencies and private contractors. The archive grew to include hundreds of pages of evidence showing coordination that extended far beyond what any legitimate policy initiative would require. But our success made us careless. Elena was supposed to meet me at a downtown park on a Thursday evening. When she didn't show up after 30 minutes, I assumed she'd been delayed or forced to cancel for security reasons. But when I got home, I found an encrypted message waiting. They know, burning everything. Stay safe. That was the last communication I received from her. The next morning, I tried calling the phone number she'd given me, but it went straight to a disconnected signal. Her backup email address returned an error message indicating the account had been terminated. It was as if Elena Rodriguez had never existed, but someone knew she had existed, and someone knew we'd been working together. I returned home from work that Friday to find my apartment door standing slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough that I could tell it had been disturbed. The lock showed no signs of damage, which meant whoever had entered either had keys or possessed sophisticated lock-picking skills. Nothing obvious was missing. My television, computer equipment, and jewelry were all exactly where I'd left them. But my laptop was gone, along with the portable drive where I'd been backing up our research. More disturbing, the folder Alina had given me was missing from the hiding place where I had secured it. They'd taken only what they came for, leaving everything else untouched to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. A professional job, designed to look like nothing more than a minor break-in, where the intruders had been scared away before taking anything valuable. But I knew better. I packed a bag with essentials and checked into a motel across town, paying cash and using a false name. From the safety of that anonymous room, I tried to assess the situation. Alina was gone, possibly dead. Our research had been compromised, and whoever was responsible for the break-in now knew that I'd seen evidence of their coordination. The smart thing to do would have been to run, to leave town, find a new job somewhere far away, and hope they'd consider me neutralized without taking more direct action. But I couldn't shake the feeling that running would only delay the inevitable. If Alina had been right about the scope and timeline of the implementation, then there would be nowhere to run. By 2030, the system would be global, and geographic escape would be impossible. The only real safety lay in exposure and resistance. But first, I needed to retrieve the backup files I'd hidden at the bank. I waited until Monday morning, then took a deliberately circuitous route to the safety deposit box location, watching for signs of surveillance. The street seemed normal, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. 3 different times I noticed the same dark sedan in my peripheral vision, always maintaining distance, never close enough to be obviously tailing me. The safety deposit box contained everything Alina and I had compiled, plus additional materials I'd gathered independently. Financial records, organizational charts, communications intercepts, and technical specifications for systems that hadn't been publicly announced. Enough evidence to prove coordination, but presented in a way that could easily be dismissed as coincidence by anyone not already convinced of the conspiracy. I was photocopying key documents when I noticed increased activity in the bank lobby, more security guards than usual, and customers who seemed more interested in watching the clientele than conducting banking business. The manager kept glancing in my direction with an expression that suggested he was expecting something to happen. I finished copying the most critical documents and returned the originals to the safety deposit box, but I could feel the walls closing in. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Exit through the rear service corridor. You have approximately 90 seconds. Alina. Somehow, she was still alive and watching. I followed the instructions, slipping through a maintenance door that led to an alley behind the bank. A motorcycle was waiting, engine running, with a helmet hanging from the handlebars. No rider in sight, just another anonymous message taped to the fuel tank. Take Highway 9 north. Abandoned bike at mile marker 47. Continue on foot. I'd never ridden a motorcycle before, but desperation made for a quick learning curve. The bike lurched and stalled twice before I managed to get it moving, but soon I was weaving through traffic toward the highway, my bag of copied documents secured under my jacket. In the rearview mirror, I watched the dark sedan emerge from the bank parking lot, followed by 2 more vehicles that had materialized from side streets. They maintained professional distance, but their coordination was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Highway 9 wound through rural farmland before entering forested hills. I pushed the motorcycle faster than was safe, taking curves at speeds that made the bike lean dangerously. But my pursuers had more powerful vehicles, and the gap between us was slowly closing. Mile marker 47 appeared just as the first sedan was close enough that I could see the driver's face in my mirror. I pulled off the road into a dense stand of trees, abandoned the bike as instructed, and plunged into the forest, carrying my bag and hoping that Alina's plan included more than just continue on foot. The woods were thick enough to provide cover, but I could hear car doors slamming behind me and voices coordinating a search. These weren't local police or federal agents conducting a routine investigation. The communication I overheard was too professional, too military in its efficiency. I'd been hiking for 20 minutes when I heard the helicopter. The aircraft appeared through the canopy overhead, flying in a search pattern with what looked like thermal imaging equipment. I pressed myself against the largest tree I could find and tried to remain motionless, but the helicopter circled back twice, its searchlight probing the forest floor. That's when I realized how far beyond normal law enforcement this had escalated. Whatever Alina and I had discovered, it was important enough to justify significant resources and risk considerable exposure. They weren't just trying to silence us, they were treating us as threats to something vital enough to deploy military-grade assets. The helicopter moved on, but I could hear searchers working their way through the trees, calling out grid coordinates and maintaining radio contact with their command structure. I needed to find better shelter, and I needed to get my evidence to someone who could use it. I was stumbling through undergrowth, trying to put distance between myself and the search teams, when I nearly walked into the woman standing behind a massive oak tree. Alina looked different, thinner, older, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of running and hiding. But she was alive, and she gestured for silence while we listened to the search teams passing nearby. When the voices faded, she spoke in whispers. They raided my safe house 3 days ago, killed my contact, and burned everything we hadn't already moved. She studied my face in the dim forest light. How much did you manage to save? I showed her the bag of documents, copies of everything we compiled, plus some additional material I'd gathered independently. It's not enough, she said. Not nearly enough to convince anyone who isn't already looking for the truth. We need something undeniable, something that can't be dismissed or discredited. What do you have in mind? Alina pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. I still have access to some internal systems. My credentials haven't been revoked yet, probably because they don't want to create obvious evidence of a security breach, but it's only a matter of time. Access to what? Planning databases, communication archives, financial tracking systems. She activated the device, and its screen showed a complex interface with multiple security layers. If we can get to a hardwired connection point, I can download comprehensive proof of the coordination and planning. Where do we find a connection point? There's a data center about 15 miles from here. Meridian Consulting has server space there for their government contracts. If your employee credentials are still active, we might be able to get inside. The idea was insane. We were being hunted by people with helicopters and thermal imaging equipment, and Alina wanted to break into a secure facility to steal classified data. But looking at the determination in her eyes, I realized she was right. Half measures wouldn't be enough. We needed proof so comprehensive and undeniable that even the sophisticated manipulation strategies couldn't discredit it. How do we get there without being caught? Alina smiled grimly, very carefully. We spent the next 6 hours moving through the forest, avoiding search teams and aircraft, while Alina used her modified device to monitor pursuit communications. The searchers were thorough and well-equipped, but they were operating under constraints that limited their effectiveness. Too much visible activity would draw unwanted attention from local authorities and media. By dawn, we'd reached the edge of the forest near a rural highway. Elena had been tracking traffic through surveillance networks, identifying patterns and gaps that would allow us to move without being detected. A delivery truck was scheduled to stop at a convenience store 2 miles from the data center, providing cover for our final approach. Once we're inside the facility, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before someone notices the unauthorized access, Elena said as we waited for the truck to arrive. I'll need that long to penetrate the security layers and download everything we can carry. And if we're caught, then people who ask questions about sustainability programs will know what happened to us. The truck arrived on schedule, and we managed to slip into the cargo area during the driver's restroom break. 20 minutes later, we were hiding behind a dumpster outside the data center, watching security guards patrol the perimeter. Elena studied the building through small binoculars. 3 guards, standard rotation every hour. Camera coverage on all entrances, but there's a maintenance access point on the north side that's in a blind spot for about 40 seconds during shift changes. What about internal security? Biometric locks, access card readers, motion sensors. But your employee card should get us through the first 2 barriers, and I can handle the electronic systems once we're inside. We waited for the next guard rotation, then sprinted across an open parking area to the maintenance door. Elena connected her device to the lock mechanism while I watched for patrols. The lock clicked open just as footsteps echoed from around the corner. Inside, the data center hummed with the sound of thousands of servers processing information for dozens of government agencies and private contractors. Elena led me through corridors lined with racks of equipment, navigating by memory and occasionally checking her device for layout updates. There, she whispered, pointing to a terminal station surrounded by screens displaying network activity. That's our access point. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering commands and passwords that bypassed security protocols I didn't understand. Screens filled with data streams, file directories, and communication logs that painted a picture of coordination so vast and detailed that even our previous research had barely scratched the surface. This is incredible, Elena breathed, watching terabytes of information flow past. Financial transactions between organizations on 6 continents. Personnel transfers coordinated across dozens of agencies. Technical specifications for systems that won't be announced for another year. She inserted a high-capacity storage device and began downloading everything she could access. File after file of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that the sustainability programs were components of a carefully orchestrated plan to restructure human society. But our time was running out. Alarms began sounding in distant parts of the building, and Elena's device showed security alerts cascading through the network. "They know we're here," she said, still typing furiously. "Another few minutes and I'll have everything." That's when the lights went out, and emergency lighting bathed the server room in red illumination. Through the corridors, I could hear doors slamming and radio chatter as security teams converged on our location. Elena yanked the storage device from the terminal. "That's all we're getting. Time to go." But as we turned toward the exit, figures in tactical gear emerged from both ends of the corridor, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands to surrender. We were trapped. The tactical team that surrounded us moved with military precision, but they weren't wearing any identifying insignia or badges. No agency names, no unit designations, just black uniforms and professional equipment operated by people who clearly weren't local law enforcement. "Device on the ground," the team leader commanded. "Hands visible." Elena hesitated, clutching the storage drive that contained terabytes of incriminating evidence. For a moment, I thought she might try to destroy it rather than let them recover the data. But faced with multiple weapons, she complied, setting the device on the floor and raising her hands. "We're not terrorists," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're researchers investigating." Silence. The team leader approached Elena, studying her face with recognition. "Former Undersecretary Rodriguez, you've been difficult to locate." "I imagine I have been." One of the tactical officers collected the storage device while others secured our hands with plastic restraints. They were efficient and professional, but there was something unsettling about their behavior. No reading of rights, no identification of their authority, no explanation of charges or procedures. "What happens now?" I asked. The team leader ignored my question, speaking into a throat microphone in a language I didn't recognize. The response seemed to satisfy him because he nodded to his team and gestured toward the exit. They marched us through the data center to a loading dock where two black vehicles waited. As they prepared to separate us into different cars, Elena caught my eye and mouthed a single word: "Remember." That was the last time I saw her. My captors drove for several hours through rural areas I didn't recognize, eventually arriving at what looked like a corporate retreat center, surrounded by high fences and discreet security measures. They escorted me to a comfortable room that might have been a hotel suite if not for the reinforced door and lack of windows. For 3 days, no one spoke to me. Food appeared through a slot in the door, and I was allowed supervised access to bathroom facilities, but my guards remained silent despite my attempts at conversation. I began to wonder if they were planning to hold me indefinitely, or if something worse was being prepared. On the 4th day, a woman in a business suit entered my room carrying a laptop computer and a stack of documents. "I'm Director Sarah Chen," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "I believe you have some questions about recent events. Where Elena, former Undersecretary Rodriguez, is being debriefed at another facility. Her cooperation will determine her future treatment." Director Chen opened her laptop and showed me surveillance footage of Elena and myself at various locations over the past weeks. The coverage was comprehensive, clearly demonstrating that our activities had been monitored far more closely than we'd realized. "We know about your collaboration, your research, and your infiltration of the data center," she continued. "What we need to understand is the extent of your knowledge and the scope of your documentation. I want to speak with a lawyer." "You're not under arrest, and this isn't a criminal proceeding. Consider this a national security consultation." Chen showed me financial records proving that Meridian Consulting received substantial funding from the same organizations Elena and I had been investigating. My own employer was part of the network we'd been trying to expose. "Your research was quite thorough," she admitted. "Impressively so, given your limited access to classified information. But you've misunderstood the nature and purpose of the coordination you discovered." "Have I? The programs you've documented represent humanity's best hope for addressing multiple existential crises simultaneously. Climate change, resource depletion, population pressures, technological disruption, all of these threaten our species' survival. Coordinated response isn't conspiracy, it's necessity." Chen pulled up charts and projections that painted a dire picture of humanity's future without intervention: environmental collapse within decades, resource wars that would kill billions, social breakdown that would destroy civilization itself. The coordination you've discovered exists because voluntary compliance with necessary changes has proven insufficient, she explained. Democracy and individual choice are luxuries that become dangerous when the stakes involve species survival. So you're admitting that the programs are designed to control people. I'm explaining that some degree of behavioral management is essential for ensuring that enough humans survive the coming crisis to maintain technological civilization. Chen's tone was matter of fact, as if she were discussing weather forecasts rather than the systematic elimination of human freedom. And who decides what constitutes necessary control? People with access to comprehensive data and the responsibility for long-term outcomes. Scientists, policy analysts, systems engineers, experts who understand the complexity of the challenges we face. Chen showed me additional documents that detailed the decision-making processes behind the sustainability programs. Groups of highly credentialed professionals making choices based on computer models that calculated optimal outcomes for human survival and environmental stability. Every restriction, every monitoring system, every behavioral modification protocol has been designed to maximize the probability that technological civilization will persist through the crisis period, she said. Personal freedom is irrelevant if there's no surviving society to exercise that freedom within. But what if people don't want to be saved at the cost of their autonomy? Then they'll be saved anyway, because the alternative is extinction. Chen closed her laptop and studied my face. You have a choice, Marcus. You can accept that the coordination you've discovered serves a necessary purpose, or you can be classified as a threat to species survival. What does that classification entail? People who actively resist necessary survival measures cannot be allowed to interfere with implementation. Her voice remained calm and professional. Resistance will be contained through whatever means prove most effective. She stood up and walked toward the door. You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. After Chen left, I sat alone in my comfortable prison, thinking about Elena's final word, remember. Not resist or fight or escape, but remember. She wanted me to preserve what we'd learned, to document the truth regardless of what happened to us personally. That night, I used the room's basic amenities to create a primitive but functional recording device. If they planned to kill me or disappear me like so many others, I wanted to leave behind an account of what I discovered. But as morning approached, a different plan began to form. Chen had revealed more than she'd intended about the scope and coordination of the programs. If I could get that information to people who weren't part of the system, who might still be capable of resistance. The problem was finding a way to escape from a secure facility surrounded by professional guards and located in an unknown rural area. That's when I remembered the ventilation system I'd noticed during my supervised bathroom visits. The air circulation in the building was surprisingly robust, suggesting larger ducts than normal. If I could access the ductwork during the night shift when fewer guards were active. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but it was the only option I could identify. Elena and I had gathered enough evidence to prove the coordination and intent behind the sustainability programs. Now I needed to find a way to get that evidence to people who could act on it. because if Chen was right about their timeline, there wasn't much time left. The countdown to 2030 was accelerating, and voluntary compliance was about to become mandatory enforcement. If someone didn't expose the truth soon, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had felt like. That night I began my escape attempt, knowing that failure would likely mean death, but also knowing that staying silent would mean something even worse: the permanent victory of a system that viewed human autonomy as an obstacle to be eliminated. As I crawled through the ventilation system toward an uncertain freedom, Alina's voice echoed in my memory. Remember. I would remember. And if I survived, I would make sure others remembered too. The ventilation system led me through the building's interior to a roof access point that emerged behind a cluster of communication equipment. From there, I could see the facility's perimeter, motion sensors, thermal cameras, and patrol routes that created overlapping coverage zones. But I could also see something the guards probably hadn't noticed: a service road that wound through the forest to a highway maintenance station about 2 miles away. Getting off the roof and across the monitored perimeter required timing and luck. I waited until the patrol cycles created a 40-second gap in coverage near the eastern fence, then dropped to the ground and sprinted toward the tree line. Motion sensors tracked my movement, but by the time the response team reached my position, I was already deep enough in the forest to avoid their thermal imaging. The service road was overgrown and clearly abandoned, but it provided a path through the woods that avoided the main security sensors. I followed it through the night, expecting pursuit teams to emerge from the darkness at any moment, but either my escape hadn't been discovered yet, or they were confident enough in their perimeter security to assume I couldn't have gotten far. The highway maintenance station was a collection of rusted equipment and storage sheds that hadn't been used in years. But it had what I needed: a working telephone line connected to the state highway system. Using calling cards I'd purchased weeks earlier, I began making contact with the network of researchers and journalists who'd been asking questions about the sustainability programs. The first 3 people I called had disconnected numbers. The fourth was answered by someone who claimed never to have heard of the person I was trying to reach. But the 5th call connected me with Alex Morrison, an investigative journalist who'd been documenting inconsistencies in climate policy implementation. "I know who you are," Alex said after I identified myself. "Elena Rodriguez contacted me before she disappeared. She said you might call if something happened to her. She's alive, but being held by people who don't officially exist. Can you prove what you're claiming? I have documents, communications, financial records, and organizational charts that prove coordination between agencies and corporations on 6 continents. Everything we need to demonstrate that the sustainability programs are components of a larger control system." Alex was quiet for a moment. "Where are the documents? Hidden in multiple locations. But first, I need guarantees about how this information will be used. If you publish it the wrong way, they'll discredit it as conspiracy theorizing and use the attention to accelerate their timeline. What do you suggest?" Simultaneous release across multiple platforms with technical verification of the document authenticity and financial confirmation of the relationships we've mapped. Make it impossible to dismiss as fabricated evidence. Alex agreed to coordinate with contacts at other publications and technical organizations. We established a timeline for document delivery and verification, with publications scheduled for exactly 72 hours later. Enough time to properly authenticate the evidence, but not enough for the coordinating organizations to mount an effective suppression campaign. But first, I had to retrieve the evidence from its hiding places without being captured. Over the next 2 days, I moved carefully between the locations where Alina and I had cached our research: bank safety deposit boxes, storage lockers, and dead drops we'd established in case our primary archives were compromised. Each retrieval required elaborate security measures to avoid the surveillance networks that were undoubtedly looking for me. The most dangerous recovery was the data storage device Alina had hidden at a commercial facility across town from where she'd been captured. Getting to it required passing through areas that were certainly being monitored, using public transportation that would create records of my movement. I solved the surveillance problem by adopting the appearance and behavior of the city's homeless population: dirty clothes, unkempt appearance, and the kind of invisible desperation that made most people look away rather than remember faces. The disguise was psychologically difficult but operationally effective. Security cameras recorded me, but human attention filtered me out as irrelevant. The storage facility contained Alina's most sensitive archives: communication intercepts between coordination directors, financial tracking systems that showed money moving between organizations, and technical specifications for monitoring systems that hadn't been publicly announced. But it also contained something I hadn't expected: a video file labeled Emergency Broadcast, Final Testimony. Alina had recorded the video shortly before her capture, speaking directly to the camera with the kind of urgency that suggested she knew she was running out of time. "If you're watching this, then the coordination has been exposed, and I'm either dead or disappeared," she began. "What Marcus and I discovered represents the largest social engineering project in human history. Not a conspiracy by evil people, but a coordinated effort by people who genuinely believe that human freedom is incompatible with species survival." The video detailed information that Alina hadn't shared during our collaboration: names of key coordinators, locations of planning facilities, and timelines for implementation phases that extended beyond 2030. "The 2030 target date is just the beginning," she explained. Phase 3 establishes the control infrastructure, but Phase 4 involves what they call optimization protocols: systematic reduction of global population to what computer models indicate is the maximum sustainable level for technological civilization. Alina's final message was addressed to whoever would eventually broadcast the evidence. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about whether human beings will be allowed to make their own choices about their lives, their communities, and their future. The people implementing these programs believe that freedom is a luxury we can't afford. They may be right about the severity of the crisis we face, but they're wrong about the solution. I copied Alina's video along with the other archived materials, then destroyed the original storage system to prevent recovery by pursuit teams. By the time I reached the final rendezvous point, I was carrying comprehensive proof of coordination that spanned multiple continents and involved hundreds of organizations. Alex Morrison had assembled a coalition of journalists, researchers, and technical experts who would simultaneously verify and publish the evidence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: overwhelm the suppression capabilities of even the most sophisticated coordination networks by releasing information through so many channels that controlling the narrative would be impossible. On the appointed day, I delivered the complete archive to Alex's team and waited for the storm to break. The initial coverage was everything we'd hoped for: detailed analysis of the financial relationships, technical verification of document authenticity, and expert commentary that confirmed the feasibility of the coordination we documented. For 48 hours, it seemed like we'd succeeded in exposing the truth, but then the counter-narrative began. The same news outlets that had initially covered the story began running follow-up pieces questioning the interpretation of the evidence. Expert sources appeared who offered alternative explanations for the coordination patterns, legitimate policy cooperation, standard bureaucratic relationships, normal business arrangements between contractors and agencies. The documents are real, these experts acknowledged, but they represent routine governmental and corporate activities rather than evidence of conspiracy. Climate policy requires coordination. International cooperation is essential for addressing global challenges. The patterns you've identified are exactly what effective governance should look like. Social media platforms began flagging our evidence as disputed information and potentially misleading content. Search algorithms modified to reduce the visibility of articles about the coordination. Discussion forums where people shared our documents were closed for policy violations. Within a week, public attention had moved on to other stories. The comprehensive evidence that Alina and I had risked our lives to gather was dismissed by mainstream discourse as another conspiracy theory promoted by people who didn't understand the complexity of modern governance. But we had succeeded in one crucial way. We'd created a permanent record that couldn't be completely suppressed. People who were looking for the truth could find it, could study the evidence, could draw their own conclusions about what it meant. And as the months passed, some of those people began to notice patterns that confirmed our warnings. 6 months later, I'm writing this from a cabin in rural Montana, living off-grid with cash transactions and avoiding any technology that could be used to track my location. The official story is that I suffered a mental breakdown and disappeared, leaving behind rambling conspiracy theories that no serious person would take seriously. Alina was released after 3 weeks of debriefing, but she's not the same person who risked everything to expose the truth. When she appears in public now, she speaks about the importance of international cooperation and the necessity of accepting temporary restrictions on personal freedom to address climate change. Her eyes have a vacant quality that suggests pharmaceutical management of her personality. Our evidence is still available to anyone persistent enough to look for it, but it's been successfully marginalized through the same techniques we documented: expert counter-narratives, algorithmic suppression, and social media manipulation. The truth exists, but it's been rendered effectively invisible to most people, and the implementation continues. Over the past 6 months, the changes have accelerated in ways that make our warning seem prophetic. Major banks announced mandatory digital identity verification for all accounts, citing the need to prevent fraud and ensure regulatory compliance. Anyone without approved digital credentials finds themselves unable to access their money. Social media platforms implemented verified citizen requirements for posting or commenting, claiming the need to combat misinformation and protect democratic institutions. Anonymous speech has been effectively eliminated from digital communication. Streaming services, e-commerce sites, and online service providers rolled out verified citizen login systems that require government identification to access content. Entertainment and shopping have become privileges granted to compliant citizens. The carbon credit systems we documented are now operational in major cities, with personal behavior tracked through smartphone monitoring, purchase surveillance, and periodic compliance verification. Citizens who fail to meet sustainability targets find themselves restricted from certain activities and locations. Employment in most major corporations now requires participation in behavioral modification programs that monitor everything from dietary choices to social media activity. Noncompliance results in professional exclusion that makes economic survival difficult. The changes happen gradually enough that each new restriction seems reasonable in isolation, justified by immediate crisis, and presented as temporary measures that will be relaxed once stability is achieved. But people with longer memories can see the pattern. Each temporary restriction becomes permanent infrastructure for the next phase of control. I'm sitting in a library in a small town where they haven't yet installed biometric scanners for internet access. The computer I'm using doesn't require government identification, though I know that's changing. Signs posted throughout the building announce that new security measures will be implemented next month to ensure patron safety and prevent unauthorized access. On the news website, a UN representative is speaking about the success of digital identity programs in reducing fraud and improving service delivery. She announces that by 2030, all essential services will be tied to universal digital identification to ensure equitable access and protect vulnerable populations. As she speaks, the library computer screen freezes. A message appears: session terminated, credentials required. I look around the library and notice that half the computers now display the same message. The technician is installing new card readers at each terminal, requiring government identification to access the internet. Outside the library windows, construction workers are installing biometric scanners at the entrance to the grocery store across the street. A small crowd has gathered to watch, some curious, others concerned, but no one is protesting. The changes are presented as upgrades to improve efficiency and security. I pack up my things and walk toward the exit, passing the information desk where librarians are helping patrons register for the new identification requirements. Their voices are cheerful and helpful as they explain how the new system will make library services more convenient and secure. The countdown Alina and I discovered isn't to some distant dystopian future. It's to the completion of a transformation that's already underway, implemented gradually enough that most people don't recognize the scope of what's changing. As I walk past the grocery store with its new biometric scanners, I whisper into the voice recorder I've been using to document these final observations. We're not waiting for 2030 anymore. It's already here. The recording device clicks off, and I realize this might be the last time I'm able to document the truth without sophisticated countermeasures to detect and suppress it. Soon, even whispered testimony in small-town libraries will be monitored and analyzed by systems designed to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. Alina was right about one thing. The people implementing these systems genuinely believe they're saving humanity from itself. They may even be correct about the severity of the crisis we face, but they're fundamentally wrong about the solution. Freedom isn't a luxury that humanity can't afford. It's the foundation that makes everything else worth preserving. Without the right to make our own choices, to speak our own thoughts, and to determine our own futures, survival becomes indistinguishable from sophisticated imprisonment. The evidence Alina and I gathered will survive in hidden archives and encrypted networks, waiting for a generation that might remember what freedom felt like. Maybe someday people will rediscover the courage to choose uncertainty over security, autonomy over optimization, and human dignity over species management. But that day feels very far away as I watch the scanners being installed and the last anonymous spaces disappearing into a world where every action, every movement, every thought is monitored, recorded, and evaluated by systems that know what's best for us better than we do ourselves. The 2030 directive isn't coming, it's here. What if the most powerful secret society in the world wasn't hiding evil plans, but keeping something far worse from awakening? Tonight's chilling tale takes us deep into the redwood forests of California, where ancient rituals and modern power collide. But first, make sure to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories, and leave your video ideas in the comments below. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between my electric bill and rejection letters. Plain white paper, no return address. My name was written in careful block letters, Alex Morgan. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper with an embossed header that made my hands shake, the Bohemian Club, San Francisco. Below it, an invitation to the summer encampment at Bohemian Grove, July 15th, 31st, 2024. At the bottom, in rushed handwriting, this is your last chance to see the truth. Don't waste it. Bohemian Grove. I'd heard the whispers, read the conspiracy theories, seen the grainy photos of men in robes burning effigies before a massive owl statue. Political theater, most assumed. Rich men playing dress-up while planning wars or market crashes. But this invitation was real. Someone wanted me inside those gates. The question was why. On July 14th, I packed light, a hidden camera, a digital recorder disguised as an inhaler, a notebook. I drove north through wine country as the sun set. A man in a plain suit met me at a defunct gas station. "Leave your keys," he said. "Someone will return your car when you're finished." Finished with what? He didn't answer. The SUV had soundproof partitions and no interior door handles. Whatever was happening, there would be no turning back. We stopped at the Mandalay camp near a lake. The man handed me a leather folder. "Your documentation. Keep your head down, mouth shut, eyes open." Inside was a camp roster listing me as Morgan, Investment Banking, Chicago. Tomorrow night was marked in red. Cremation of care ceremony, 9:30 p.m., Sacred Grove. And a final note, watch for the second ceremony. That's where the real truth begins. Morning brought laughter and casual conversation. Men who controlled trillions shuffled around in bathrobes and flip-flops. It was exactly what it looked like, the most exclusive summer camp in the world. I dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, the Grove's unofficial uniform, and explored. Senators, CEOs, former presidents argued about baseball scores like aging fraternity brothers. This was where real policy got made, not in committee meetings, but in informal moments away from cameras. That evening, I joined the stream toward the Sacred Grove, a natural amphitheater dominated by a 40-foot concrete owl with burning eyes. Hundreds of folding chairs faced a stage where hooded, robed figures prepared props. The ceremony began with a choir singing a funeral dirge. 24 men escorted a coffin draped in black cloth. A voice boomed, "The death of care, its cremation before the great owl." Flames leaped toward the owl's glowing eyes as hundreds watched in reverent silence. Then the lights went out, absolute darkness. No panic, just unnatural silence. Then footsteps measured, deliberate, moving through the crowd. A voice spoke Latin. Others joined in a chant that vibrated in my chest. This wasn't part of the official ceremony. When the lights returned, the spell broke. But as we filed out, 24 men walked deeper into the forest, following a path I hadn't noticed. All carried flashlights. All moved with purpose. I followed at a distance. The path wound uphill to a smaller clearing hidden by dense forest. Here stood a second amphitheater, older, carved from natural rock. At its center, a stone altar covered in symbols and a wooden crate marked with dates from the 1940s. 24 men formed a circle in simple black clothing. They chanted of binding and containment, of keeping something sleeping. One man spotted me, younger, military posture. "We have a visitor." I stepped forward. Alex Morgan, Mandalay Camp. An older man emerged, a former defense secretary. "Show him," he said. 2 men stepped aside. The altar bore spiraling symbols that seemed to shift in torchlight. The crate contained gleaming metal discs. "Do you know what you're looking at?" the defense secretary asked. I shook my head. Project Owl, started in 1943. The Grove isn't just a social club, it's a containment facility. "For what?" A woman appeared behind me. Silver hair, practical yet expensive clothes. Helena Hartwell, managing Project Owl since 1987. Women aren't allowed in the social aspects, but some secrets are too important for gender politics. She lifted a metal disc. Recovered from a Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1943, the SS thought they'd found artifacts to summon ancient powers. They were half right. They released something that had been contained for centuries. What kind of something? Call it what you like. Ancient god, interdimensional entity, primordial force of chaos. What matters is what it does when free. The defense secretary showed a tablet, a world map with red markers. Every time the binding weakens, we see spikes in catastrophic events. Political assassinations, market crashes, natural disasters. Chaos spreads like a virus. Helena added, old-growth forests have natural resonance with spiritual phenomena. The annual gathering reinforces containment. The cremation of care is theater for the masses while we handle the real work. Why tell me this? Helena and the defense secretary exchanged glances. Because we're dying off. New money doesn't understand old responsibilities. Tech billionaires think everything can be sold with apps. They don't believe in things that can't be quantified. We need documentation, insurance in case the oral tradition breaks down. What happens if the binding fails completely? Silence. Finally, the younger man, look at any period of sustained global chaos. The fall of Rome, the Black Death, the World Wars, times when cause and effect stopped making sense. Those weren't natural processes. They were what happens when humanity loses the ability to maintain certain spiritual defenses. A low rumble echoed through the forest. Torches flickered. Symbols glowed. Time to go, Helena said quietly. The effects can be unpredictable. As they dispersed, she whispered, tomorrow, if you're serious, we'll show you the archives, the complete record of Project Owl. I barely slept, every sound amplified, branches creaking, night birds calling. When dawn came, Helena found me at breakfast. Ready for the historical tour, she led me past popular areas to a weathered maintenance shed. Inside, a concrete staircase descended into bedrock. Fluorescent lights flickered on. Built during the Cold War, officially an emergency shelter. Unofficially, the archive. Steel doors slid open. A vast underground chamber stretched in all directions. Metal shelving reached toward shadows. Boxes, files, artifacts spanning 8 decades. "Welcome to the real history of the 20th century," Helena said. She pulled a thick file. Einstein consulted on the project for 6 months before concluding the artifacts operated beyond current physics. Handwritten notes filled pages. Consciousness might play a more active role in physical processes than anyone wanted to admit. She showed photographs of Tibetan monks working alongside Western archaeologists. Stone chambers carved into mountains held identical artifacts. They'd been expecting someone. According to their records, this wasn't the first time the binding had been broken. At least 7 documented instances over the past millennium. Each disruption led to wars, plagues, social collapse. Major historical events correlated with containment stress. Chicken and egg, she explained. Which is why prevention became our focus. In the center, monitors displayed real-time data. Seismic readings, atmospheric measurements, psychic resonance levels. Declining, Helena said gravely. Accelerating in the past 5 years. Maybe 2-3 years before complete failure. Worst case, the end of human civilization as we know it, not through war or climate change, through the breakdown of psychological and spiritual structures that allow complex societies to exist. She loaded a film reel, black and white footage of SS uniforms in a Tibetan monastery. Shadows moved independently. Equipment malfunctioned. Expedition members turned violent. They thought they'd found weapons. What they actually found was something that used them as weapons against each other. Another reel showed American soldiers exhibiting similar symptoms within weeks. Project Owl was established to contain and study the artifacts. The Grove became the testing ground. It worked for almost 80 years. But the binding requires constant maintenance. Each generation faces new challenges. Recent footage showed monitoring equipment tracking energy fluctuations during ceremonies. The science isn't complete. We're working with phenomena at the intersection of consciousness and physics, but the effects are measurable, reproducible, and critical for global stability. Why hasn't this been published? Publication would destroy effectiveness. The binding works partly because participants believe in what they're doing. Widespread skepticism would undermine the psychological foundations. She gestured to monitors showing steady decline, but secrecy might now be more dangerous than exposure. Traditional power structures are fragmenting. New forms of influence emerge faster than we can adapt. The entity itself is evolving, exploiting modern communication systems. What are you asking me to do? Document everything. Learn how the system works. Prepare a complete record. Then help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where power operates through social media and digital networks. And if I refuse, then you'll have an interesting story about rich men performing rituals. People will read it as entertainment, and the most important secret in human history will die with us. That night, we watched the complete archive. Footage from 1962 showed research subjects exposed to weakened containment turning violent within hours. Multiply that by global population, Helena said quietly, and you begin to understand what we're trying to prevent. Above us, the Grove continued normal activities, powerful people networking, unaware their retreat served a purpose that might determine civilization's survival. I woke before dawn to helicopters circling overhead. Helena appeared at my cabin door, urgent tension replacing her usual composure. Someone been monitoring our activities. We moved through forest cover, government aircraft. Different agencies have different clearance levels. Some know enough to be suspicious, but not enough to understand consequences. Motion sensors detected activity below ground. The underground facility is compromised. We need backup systems. We reached a massive redwood. Helena pressed bark. A panel slid aside, revealing modern equipment built into living wood. Readings were worse than ever. Electromagnetic interference. Aircraft disrupting resonance fields. As if summoned, a helicopter passed directly overhead. Monitoring equipment spiked. We need to evacuate sensitive materials. Halfway back to my cabin, shooting started, not gunfire, but electrical discharges. Flashes of light moving in unnatural patterns. Containment failure, Helena said anxiously. Localized manifestation. A Grove member appeared, face twisted with irrational rage, carrying a broken branch. "You're the one lying to us," he swung with murderous intent. Helena dodged. This is what happens when containment fails. People lose capacity for rational cooperation. More members joined, moving with pack mentality, communicating through sounds bypassing language. "Emergency binding ritual," Helena said, leading me to a concealed facility. Portable containment kit. She handed me a warm metal disc. "Hold this. Think calming thoughts. Visualize peace, cooperation. The binding responds to consciousness but requires focused intention." Outside, attackers tested the door with animal cunning. Their intelligence is being affected, losing abstract reasoning. "It needs more participants," Helena admitted. "At least 7. I was hoping 2 would suffice." The door buckled. "Run," she said, gathering essential artifacts. "Service road 2 miles north. Follow east to Highway 101, then south to San Francisco." She handed me an encrypted satellite communicator. "Speed dial 1 connects to backup facility in Colorado. Tell them what happened." The door gave way as we climbed out a rear exit. I heard Helena shouting Latin, saw flashes of light, ran through forest for over an hour. The communicator finally picked up signal. "Project Owl emergency line, state clearance and location." "I don't have clearance." Helena Hartwell gave me this device. "Containment failure at Bohemian Grove." Pause. "Are you the journalist?" "Yes. We've been expecting your call. Emergency extraction team en route. ETA 40 minutes. Stay hidden until you see a black helicopter with owl markings." What happened to Helena? Longer pause. "Unknown. Lost contact with all Grove personnel 3 hours ago. You may be the only survivor with first-hand knowledge." The pickup helicopter was black, unmarked, whisper quiet, landed at a corporate retreat center nestled in rolling hills. Subtle security measures revealed true nature. Helena waited in the lobby, exhausted but uninjured. Relief flooded through me, followed by suspicion. "Emergency protocols," she explained. "Automated systems evacuated key personnel the moment containment failed." Conference room contained a dozen people studying screens showing Grove footage. Members moving in coordinated packs, behavior becoming less human hourly. "Complete local containment failure," Helena reported. "Entity achieved localized manifestation. Behavioral modification progressing according to predicted patterns. Affected members organized crude structures, suggesting retained intelligence." "They're creating something new," I observed. "Exactly," Helena confirmed. The entity transforms civilization into something serving its purposes rather than human ones. Modeling suggested tipping point at 10,000 affected individuals. Beyond that, containment impossible. How long to decide? Hours, Helena said grimly. Affected population attempting to breach perimeter. Alarms sounded. On screens, members systematically dismantled barriers with coordinated purpose. Adapting faster than models predicted, the woman in charge observed. Entity learning from direct interaction with modern infrastructure. I made my decision. Option 2, full binding ritual, try to save them. Helena nodded grimly. It'll require everything. If we fail, no resources left for future efforts. If we do nothing, no future to contain. Next 6 hours blurred with coordinated activity. Teams deployed carrying artifacts and equipment. Binding ritual required precise positioning, perfect timing, absolute faith in principles defying everything I'd learned. But it worked. Coordinated behavior gradually became confused, then chaotic, then slowly returned to recognizably human. By dawn, rescue teams extracted survivors, remembering nothing of transformation, but everything of normal lives. Official story blamed gas leak for temporary behavioral effects. Conspiracy theorists suggested government mind control experiments, but without hard evidence, theories joined background noise. 6 months later, I sit staring at a hard drive containing complete Project Owl documentation. Video footage, research data, historical records spanning 8 decades. Binding held, Grove members recovered completely. Immediate crisis passed. World continued normal pattern of manageable chaos. But monitoring data tells different story. Entity learned from brief manifestation. Each subsequent containment requires more resources, more participants, more sophisticated countermeasures. Traditional approaches becoming less effective yearly. Helena calls weekly with updates. Teams working on digital containment protocols. Researchers developing new methods for managing consciousness-based phenomena. Analysts tracking entities' adaptation to modern communication networks. Progress being made, but race getting closer. Phone buzzes with news alerts. Political assassinations. Simultaneous market crashes. Social unrest spreading through digital networks. Each event correlates with containment stability fluctuations. Signs old binding weakening despite best efforts. I have a choice. Hard drive contains everything needed to preserve institutional knowledge. Published as fiction, ensures information survives even if current organization fails. Presented as investigative journalism, might mobilize resources for new containment methods. But publication might also undermine psychological foundations, making binding effective. Widespread skepticism could destroy mechanisms protecting civilization for 80 years. Cursor hovers over upload button for secure server distributing files worldwide. One click exposes most important secret in human history. Or delete everything and trust people carrying burden know what they're doing. Outside window, city continues normal rhythm. Millions living unaware stability depends on secrets too dangerous for public consumption. They don't know capacity for trust, cooperation, rational discourse maintained by forces most would dismiss as impossible. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some truths are too important to share. I close laptop without deciding, knowing I'll face same choice tomorrow and day after. Every day until either binding holds permanently or everything falls apart. Hard drive sits on desk like loaded weapon, containing information that could save world or destroy it depending on use. In forest north of San Francisco, ancient redwoods continue patient growth, sheltering secrets predating human civilization. Beneath roots, monitoring equipment tracks forces existing at intersection of consciousness and physics, measuring phenomena determining whether humanity remains capable of cooperation and trust, making complex societies possible. The owl watches and waits, neither good nor evil, but something far more dangerous, a force of pure change caring nothing for human hopes or fears. And somewhere in darkness between sleeping and waking, it grows stronger. Maybe they weren't hiding power. Maybe they were hiding what power keeps at bay. But how long can any cage hold something that learns from every attempt to contain it? I guess we'll find out. Until then, let this story remind you that beneath the surface of our ordered world lies mysteries both terrifying and beautiful. Perhaps the greatest act of courage isn't exposing every secret, but understanding which ones must remain hidden to protect the fragile light of human connection. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you to places where wonder outweighs fear. Sweet dreams.